Hey there, story lovers. This is Gringotts Hub, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. Harry claimed the Slytherin-Merlin-Peverell-Gryffindor Lordships and stripped every Wizengamot member of their magic at once. Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1. The weight of old names. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry had always thought was the most unremarkable day of the week, and therefore the most likely day for remarkable things to happen. He was sitting at the kitchen table in Grimmauld Place, eating toast that had gone cold an hour ago because he'd forgotten about it, which was something he'd been doing a lot lately, forgetting small things. Forgetting to eat. Forgetting to sleep past 4 in the morning. He hadn't forgotten anything important. He remembered everything important with a clarity that felt almost surgical, like someone had taken a scalpel to the inside of his skull and carved every significant moment into the bone. He remembered the graveyard. He remembered the forest. He remembered the way Dumbledore's eyes had looked every single time the old man had chosen not to tell him something, that particular quality of kindness that was also, if you turned it slightly sideways in the light, a very sophisticated form of control. The letter was from Gringotts. Not a standard notice, he'd had those before, little printed forms about vault maintenance or interest accrual that he'd never paid much attention to. This was written on heavy cream parchment, sealed in dark wax stamped with the full Gringotts crest, and it was addressed in script so precise it looked engraved rather than written. To Harry James Potter, scion and presumptive heir of multiple ancient and noble lines, greetings. You are formally requested to present yourself at Gringotts Bank, London, at your earliest convenience, to discuss matters of inheritance, title, and obligation that have become, as of your 17th birthday, legally pressing. We do not use that word lightly. Harry read it twice. Then he drank his cold tea, stood up, and went to get his coat. He didn't tell anyone. Not because he was being secretive, he'd done enough of that, had it done to him enough, that he found the whole enterprise exhausting, but because it was 7 in the morning, Hermione was asleep, Ron was asleep, and the particular shape of whatever this was felt like something he needed to look at alone first before it became a committee discussion. The walk to the leaky cauldron took 20 minutes. Nobody looked at him twice. He'd been practicing that, the art of moving through a space without announcing himself, and he'd gotten surprisingly good at it for someone whose face had been on the front of the Daily Prophet approximately 47 times in the last 2 years. Diagon Alley was quiet at this hour, shopkeepers opening their shutters, a few witches with shopping baskets, an owl post delivery that nearly took his hat off. He walked through it and into Gringotts like he owned the place. He was working on that too. The walking like you owned the place part. The goblin at the main counter looked up, looked at him, and said, without any particular inflection, Mr. Potter. Director Ragnarok is expecting you. Follow Griphook. Harry blinked. Griphook is, reinstated. Follow him, please. Griphook appeared from a side door, and there was something in the goblin's expression that Harry couldn't entirely read, not warmth exactly, but a kind of wary reassessment, like someone recalculating a figure they'd been certain about and finding the numbers didn't add up the way they expected. You look well, Harry said, because it seemed like the thing to say. You look like someone who hasn't slept properly in 6 months, Griphook replied, and turned and walked away. Harry followed. The room they ended up in was deeper inside the bank than Harry had ever been, past the cart tracks, past the upper vaults, through 2 sets of doors that opened at Griphook's touch and nowhere else. It was a meeting room built to impress, which it did, mostly because of the table. The table was made from a single piece of stone, black and shot through with veins of gold that caught the torchlight and held it, and around the table sat 6 goblins in formal banking attire, and at the head of it sat Director Ragnarok, who Harry had never met in person but had heard described as the most politically dangerous non-human being in Britain. Ragnarok was old. Not frail old, old the way mountains were old, with that quality of having survived long enough that survival had become its own form of authority. He watched Harry take his seat with bright, sharp eyes that Harry suspected had watched a great many humans come and go and had found the majority of them ultimately unimpressive. Mr. Potter, Ragnarok said. Thank you for coming promptly. Your letter used the word pressing, Harry said. You said you don't use it lightly. We don't. Ragnar gestured to one of the other goblins, who produced a leather folder of a size that made Harry's stomach do something complicated. We'll begin with the Potter accounts, briefly, as context. Your holdings are substantial, more substantial than you likely know, since your guardians were granted access to only the most basic information during your minority, by the terms of your parents' will. I didn't know there was a will, Harry said. There were two. Your father's, which is standard and unremarkable except for the trust provisions it established. Your mother's, which is neither. Ragnar opened the folder himself. Your mother, Lily Evans Potter, née Prince, Harry went very still. Was, through her mother's line, a descendant of Eileen Prince. This you may know, if you know Severus Snape's background. He called himself the Half-Blood Prince, Harry said slowly. Yes. The prince name carries no title in and of itself. However, Eileen Prince was not a prince by birth. She was born Eileen Merlin-Gaunt, and she took her mother's husband's name to distance herself from the Gaunt family, which was, at the time, engaged in behavior that made distancing oneself from them a survival strategy. Ragnar paused. The Gaunt family are the last recognized heirs of Salazar Slytherin. You know this. I know they claimed it, Harry said. The difference between claiming and being is what we are here to discuss. Ragnar folded his hands on the table, and the other 5 goblins seemed to settle, like this was the part they'd been waiting for. Goblin record-keeping predates the Ministry of Magic by approximately 12 centuries. We have documentation on every significant magical bloodline in Britain. When Voldemort, Ragnar used the name without flinching, which Harry noted and appreciated, died, and when you survived, our inheritance tracking systems flagged a cascade of succession events that had been pending, in some cases, for decades. How many? Harry asked. Ragnar looked at him steadily. 4. The word sat on the table between them like a stone dropped in still water. Walk me through them, Harry said. Gryffindor first, as it's the most straightforward. Ragnar passed a document across the table. You are a Potter. The Potter family descends, through the maternal line of the mid-17th century, from the Peverell family. The Peverell family descends, through a legitimate but undocumented line, undocumented in ministry records, that is, not in ours, from Godric Gryffindor himself. The lineage is unbroken. There are no competing claimants. The Lordship of Gryffindor passes to you. Harry picked up the document. The parchment was ancient, the ink so old it had gone brown, but the gold seal at the bottom shone like it had been stamped yesterday. He felt something when he touched it, not magic exactly, more like the memory of magic, deep and resonant, like a bell struck in a very large, empty room. The Peverells, Ragnar continued, held a lordship independent of the Gryffindor connection, tied directly to the creation of the 3 artifacts known collectively as the Deathly Hallows. The lordship is bound to mastery of all 3 artifacts, not to blood inheritance alone. Ragnar's eyes held something that might, in a goblin, have been close to satisfaction. You are the first individual in recorded history to achieve that mastery. How do you know about that? Harry asked. We know a great many things that happen in the magical world, Mr. Potter. We are simply discreet about what we do with the knowledge. Ragnar set another document on the table. The Peverell Lordship is yours. Harry set the Gryffindor document down carefully and picked up the Peverell one. Same quality of resonance, deeper this time, older. He thought about the cloak, still folded in his pocket right this moment because he carried it everywhere. The stone, buried in the forest. The wand, which he'd repaired his own with and returned to Dumbledore's tomb. He'd returned the Elder Wand. He hadn't thought of it as giving up a lordship when he did it. I'll need to retrieve the Elder Wand, he said. The lordship activated at the moment of mastery, one of the other goblins said, a younger one, with the careful diction of someone who'd studied the relevant texts extensively. Physical possession of the artifacts isn't required for the lordship to hold. They must simply exist, and you must be their acknowledged master. Which you are. Harry nodded, filed that away, and looked back at Ragnarok. Slytherin. As I explained. Through your mother's line, Prince, Merlin Gaunt, Slytherin. The blood connection is legitimate and, as of Voldemort's death, unchallenged. The Gaunt line, through Mara P. and Tom Riddle, is now extinct. You are the sole remaining heir. Ragnarok's expression didn't change, but there was something in the pause before he continued that felt almost deliberate. You are also a Parselmouth. I thought I lost that when, Harry stopped. When the Horcrux in me was destroyed. You lost his Parseltongue, the younger goblin said. The ability gifted by the Horcrux. What remained is what was already yours through the Slytherin bloodline, dormant but present. You haven't tried to speak it since the battle, have you? Harry thought about it. He hadn't. He'd assumed it was gone and moved on. No. Try it now, Ragnarok said. Say something simple. Harry looked at the black table with its veins of gold, and he thought about the chamber, about the sink in the girl's bathroom, about the word that opened it. He opened his mouth and said, in a language that felt like it came from somewhere different than English, somewhere lower, more physical, I am here. The room was very quiet for a moment. Yes, said Ragnarok. You are. The Slytherin Lordship is yours. And Merlin, Harry said. The most complex of the four. Ragnarok sat back slightly. Merlin Ambrosius left no biological heirs. His lordship, the Lordship of Emrys, as it's formally titled, though it's known colloquially as the Merlin Lordship, was designed to pass not by blood but by magical weight. By the cumulative power and breadth of magical achievement of the claimant. Ragnarok looked at Harry with an expression that was, for the first time, something approaching direct. The parameters Merlin set were specific. The claimant must have faced death willingly. Must have mastered the self to the degree that they could sacrifice the most significant thing they held. Must have demonstrated power sufficient to defeat a dark force of civilizational threat. Harry didn't say anything. We have been tracking eligible claimants for roughly 800 years, Ragnarok said. You are the first who meets all three conditions simultaneously. I'm 17, Harry said. Merlin was 19 when he bound the first magical compact, the younger goblin said, with what sounded almost like dry amusement. Age is not one of the parameters. Harry sat for a long moment. He looked at the documents on the table, the leather folder, the 6 goblins watching him with various expressions that all shared one quality, none of them felt sorry for him. None of them felt this was too much or too complicated or more than one person should reasonably have to deal with. They were waiting for him to process and respond, which was, Harry realized, a form of respect that he was not accustomed to receiving. Most people, when they looked at him, wanted something from him, protection, or sacrifice, or inspiration, or a symbol they could point to. The goblins wanted something too, but it was simpler. They wanted him to make a decision, and they wanted the decision to be informed. What does claiming them actually mean, he asked. Practically. What changes? The younger goblin leaned forward. His name, Harry would later learn, was Sharpclaw, and he was the closest thing Gringotts had to a specialist in ancient succession law. Each lordship carries specific rights and authorities within the Wizengamot. The Gryffindor Lordship holds 1 vote on the full Wizengamot, with the authority to call an emergency session without ministerial approval. The Peverell Lordship carries 2 votes, with the specific authority to challenge any law created after the Statute of Secrecy on grounds of magical heritage violation. The Slytherin Lordship holds 1 vote, with authority over the Parseltongue Registry and the right of judicial review over any case involving magical creature law. And Merlin? Harry asked. Sharpclaw paused. Even Ragnarok seemed to settle slightly, as if acknowledging that this was the one that was different. The Lordship of Emrys, Sharpclaw said carefully, does not carry a vote. It carries a veto. Over any decision of any recognized magical governing body in Britain. It also carries the authority to convene what the Founding Compact calls a reckoning, a binding review of the ethical and magical legitimacy of any sitting governmental body. If the reckoning finds the body to be fundamentally corrupt, the Emry's Lord has the authority to strip its members of their voting rights, their governmental appointments, and, he stopped. And? Harry said. And, in cases of sufficient and documented magical malfeasance, their magic itself, Sharpclaw finished. Temporarily or permanently, at the Lord's discretion. The room was very quiet. Harry thought about Fudge denying Voldemort's return while children died. He thought about the Wizengamot sentencing him to expulsion at 15 for using a Patronus to save himself and his cousin. He thought about Umbridge's quill and the words carved into the back of his hand and the fact that she'd done the same to dozens of other students and nobody had done a single thing about it. He thought about the trial, not his, the one 20 years before his, the one where Sirius Black had gone to Azkaban without anyone bothering to check if he'd actually done anything wrong. He thought about his parents. How do I claim them, he said. Ragnarok smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this particular question. All four simultaneously? Ragnarok asked. Simultaneously, Harry confirmed. I assume that's harder. Considerably. Most claimants, historically, would claim individual lordships in sequence, over months or years, allowing their magic to adjust to each one. Claiming all four at once requires that your magical core be extensive. Is mine? Ragnarok looked at him steadily. Mr. Potter, you died, were resurrected by the power of a magical sacrifice layered over 17 years of survival against impossible odds, survived carrying a fragment of one of the darkest souls in history inside your own, and then faced and defeated said soul in single combat while wandless. Your magical core is not the concern. What is the concern? Pain, Ragnarok said simply. Claiming a lordship is not symbolic. It's a binding of your magical identity to an ancient lineage. All four at once will be, he seemed to consider his word choice. Significant. Harry looked at him. I've had worse. Yes, Ragnarok said. We know. The ritual room was 3 floors below the meeting room, accessed through a narrow corridor lit by torches that burned blue-white and threw strange shadows. The floor was engraved with interlocking circles that Harry recognized vaguely as runic, not the academic runes Hermione had studied for her OWL, but something older, the kind of runes that weren't in any textbook because they predated the books. 4 stone pedestals stood in a cardinal arrangement, and on each one sat a lordship ring, heavy, clearly ancient, each one distinct. The Gryffindor ring was gold with a red stone and a lion rampant. The Peverell ring was silver and black, set with 3 small stones that Harry instinctively recognized as connected to the 3 artifacts. The Slytherin ring was dark green and silver, the serpent entwined around the band in a coil that looked like it might actually move. And the Merlin ring was the simplest of the 4, a plain band of something that looked like no metal Harry had ever seen, dark as midnight and faintly iridescent, with a single inscription around the inner band in a language that Harry suspected wasn't any human tongue at all. You place all 4 on simultaneously, Sharpclaw explained, standing at the edge of the engraved circles. 1 on each hand, traditionally the first 2 on the right hand, the latter 2 on the left, though the order between pairs matters less than the simultaneity. Which is primary? Harry asked, studying the rings. Sharpclaw glanced at Ragnarok, then back. The Merlin ring should be last to touch skin on each hand. It's the one that will, he paused. The other's key to it. Harry walked to the first pedestal and picked up the Gryffindor ring. It was warmer than he expected, not room temperature but genuinely warm, like it had been sitting near a fire. The Peverell ring was cold, almost startlingly so. The Slytherin ring was room temperature, neutral, waiting. The Merlin ring, when he picked it up, felt like nothing, not warm, not cold, not heavy, not light. Like picking up an absence. He stood in the center of the engraved circles. Ragnarok and Sharpclaw and the other goblins arranged themselves at the edge of the room, and there was something in their positioning that felt almost ceremonial. Like witnesses at a signing. Harry held 2 rings in each hand, Gryffindor and Merlin in his right, Peverell and Slytherin in his left. He took a breath. He thought, briefly and clearly, about what he wanted from this. Not what he'd been told to want. Not what anyone needed him to want. What he actually, genuinely, wanted. He wanted them to never be able to do it again. Any of it. The trials and the dementors and the inaction and the collaboration and the umbrage-shaped corruption that sat at the center of a system that called itself just. He wanted to look at that system, which had failed his parents and Sirius and Neville's parents and every person who'd ever been ground up by its gears and spit out the other side, and he wanted to say no, this is done, this is over, and I am the one saying it. He slid the rings on simultaneously. The pain was, as Ragnarok had said, significant. It started in his hands and traveled inward through his arms and hit his chest like a wave hitting a cliff face, and Harry held it, didn't fight it, just opened up and let it move through him, because fighting it would have been like fighting the tide. The runic circles on the floor lit up, one section at a time and then all at once, burning blue-white and then gold and then a deep, saturated green and then a red so dark it was almost black. The torches went out. The room was lit entirely by the circles and by something that Harry slowly realized was coming from him. It lasted approximately 4 minutes, though it felt significantly longer. When it ended, Harry was still standing. He looked down at his hands. All 4 rings sat on his fingers, the Gryffindor on his right index, the Merlin on his right ring, the Slytherin on his left index, the Peverell on his left ring, and they had changed subtly. They no longer looked like 4 separate objects. They looked like they'd always been meant to be worn together. He could feel his magic differently. Not larger, exactly, it had always been large, he just hadn't had a language for it. More organized now, like the difference between a river and a river with banks. He knew where the edges were. He knew what he could do. He looked at Ragnarok. The Wizengamot's next session, Harry said. When is it? Thursday, Ragnarok said. 2 days. Will you provide me with the documentation I'll need? The Gringotts certification of the Lordships. The inheritance records. The legal basis for the Emery's reckoning. He paused. I want it airtight. I don't want them to have a single procedural objection to stand on. Ragnarok studied him for a moment with those bright, ancient eyes. That will take the better part of tomorrow to compile. I'll come back tomorrow afternoon, Harry said. I have some conversations to have tonight. He walked back through the bank, up through the 3 floors, past the formal meeting room, back through the carved doors, and out into the marble foyer. He walked past the main desk and out into Diagon Alley, which was now fully awake and busy with morning traffic, witches and wizards with their shopping and their owls and their ordinary lives, and Harry walked through all of it toward the leaky cauldron, and he felt, for the first time since he'd walked into the forest to die, like he was moving towards something rather than away from it. Hermione was in the kitchen when he got back. She'd made real breakfast, eggs, toast, the works, and she had 3 books open in front of her and was reading all 3 simultaneously in that way she had, eyes tracking back and forth, a quill making notes in the margin of a 4th book she was also apparently writing in. She looked up when he came in. Where did you go? She asked. Not accusatory, just noticing. Gringotts, he said, and sat down and picked up a piece of toast. She looked at him more carefully. Hermione had always been able to read him better than he'd ever been entirely comfortable with, but lately she'd gotten even sharper about it, like the war had calibrated something in her that was already precise. Something happened, she said. Several somethings. He put the toast down and held up his hands. Hermione looked at the rings. Then she looked at him. Then she slowly closed all 4 books. Harry, she said, very carefully, like she was approaching something that might bolt. Are those, Lord Potter Gryffindor-Peverell-Slytherin-Emery's, he said, and the words felt strange in his mouth, not wrong, just new. Apparently. She stared at him. There's a thing, he said, called a reckoning. I'm going to do it in the Wizengamot session on Thursday. Harry, I need you to help me prepare. I need to know everything, every member's publicly documented history of corruption, collaboration, obstruction of justice. I need it organized and cited because when I do this I need it to be undeniable. They won't be able to say it was impulsive or wrong or based on nothing. He met her eyes. I'm not going in there angry, Hermione. I'm going in there right. Hermione looked at him for a long, searching moment. He could see her working through it, the legal implications, the political ramifications, the 7 different ways this could go badly, all the arguments she might make for caution, for waiting, for doing this incrementally through proper channels. He watched all of it move across her face. And then he watched her make a decision. I'll need access to the ministry's public record archives, she said. And the Prophet's full print archive. And whatever Gringotts is willing to share about financial connections between the Wizengamot families. I can ask Ragnarok, Harry said. He seems motivated. He is absolutely motivated, Hermione said, and opened all 4 books again. Goblins have been waiting for someone to do exactly this for about 300 years. She paused. Is it real, Harry? The power? Did you feel it? He thought about the 4 minutes in the ritual room. The wave through his chest. The way his magic felt now, organized and vast, like a country seen from above. Yes, he said. It's real. Hermione nodded slowly. Then we'd better not waste it. Ron came downstairs 20 minutes later, found Harry eating eggs and Hermione buried in books with a look of terrifying focus on her face, and said, Is this a work morning or a breakfast morning, which he asked most mornings as a method of calibrating his level of alertness requirement. Both, Harry said. Ron poured himself tea, looked at the rings, looked at Harry, looked at Hermione, and sat down. Right, he said. What are we doing? Thursday, Harry said, we're going to the Wizengamot. We're not members of the Wizengamot, Ron said. I am, Harry said. 4 times over. Ron looked at the rings again. Then he nodded, with the particular quality of acceptance that Harry had always found genuinely impressive, that Ron Weasley ability to take something completely unprecedented and just calibrate to it. Are we expecting a fight? Ron asked. Probably, Harry said. But they can't fight you, Ron said, not as a question, looking at Harry with an expression that was somewhere between impressed and slightly awed. Can they? No, Harry said simply. Not anymore. That afternoon, Harry went back to see Neville. Neville Longbottom was living at his grandmother's house in Derbyshire and had been since the battle, and he answered the door looking like someone who had stopped waiting to be surprised by anything. He was broader than Harry remembered, stood differently, with the weight forward rather than back, which Harry had started to think of as the posture of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. I need to tell you something, Harry said. Come in, Neville said. Gran's out. Harry told him all of it, in the sitting room with its case of Auror memorabilia and its portrait of Neville's parents in their prime, smiling out of a photograph that always made Neville look at the floor when he saw it. Harry talked and Neville listened, and when Harry was done Neville sat for a long time with his hands braced on his knees. Thursday, Neville said finally. Thursday. My Gran has a seat on the Wizengamot, Neville said. Did you know that? Augusta Longbottom. She's been there since my parents went into St. Mungo's and she has never, in all that time, managed to make the system do a single useful thing for our family. He paused. She'll be furious at you. She'll think you're out of order. I know, Harry said. She'll be wrong, Neville said. And somewhere, privately, she'll know she's wrong. He looked at Harry steadily. What do you need from me? Thursday, Harry said. I need you there. Not to do anything, not to fight anyone. Just to be there. As a witness. As, yourself. Neville nodded slowly. I'll be there, he said. Walking back to Grimmauld Place in the late afternoon light, Harry passed a newsstand with the prophet on display and saw his own face staring up at him from the front page under the headline Wizarding World at a Crossroads. Where is the boy who lived? He picked up the paper, read the first 3 paragraphs, which were the journalistic equivalent of wringing hands, and put it back. He wasn't the boy who lived. He hadn't been for a while, probably. He was something the prophet didn't have a category for yet. He'd give them one on Thursday. 2 days, he thought, and walked home under a sky that was going pink and gold at the edges, and felt the 4 rings warm against his fingers, and thought about all the names that had come down to him through centuries of blood and magic and history, all the weight of all those old names settling against him not like a burden but like an answer to a question he'd been asking since he was 11 years old and didn't know what the question was. Who are you? The weight of old names, it turned out, felt less like weight than he'd expected. It felt like solid ground. He went home. He ate dinner. He helped Hermione compile a list of names that ran to 4 pages by midnight. He slept without dreaming for the first time in months. Chapter 2, The Hall of Judgment. Thursday came in grey and cold, the kind of London morning that couldn't decide between fog and rain and settled on both, a thin drizzle that got into your collar and stayed there. Harry stood outside the phone box entrance to the Ministry of Magic at 8:30, hands in his pockets, and watched the street for a moment before going in. Hermione was beside him with a leather satchel that contained 4 copies of every document Gringotts had provided, inheritance certifications, bloodline records, 3 centuries of goblin-verified succession law, and 18 pages of formally compiled Wizengamot misconduct that she'd organized chronologically, thematically, and alphabetically by surname, because Hermione Granger prepared for things the way other people breathed. Ron was on his left, wearing his best robes and looking like someone who had decided to be calm about this and was succeeding through sheer force of will. Neville stood just behind Harry's right shoulder with his arms folded and an expression of focused quiet that Harry had first seen on him in the Department of Mysteries and had come to associate with the version of Neville Longbottom that people consistently underestimated. "Right," Harry said. "When we go in, we've been over it," Ron said. "I know. Twice," Hermione added. "And a 3rd time this morning," Neville said. Harry looked at all 3 of them. "I was going to say, when we go in, whatever happens in there, I need you all to know that I'm aware this is going to be spectacular," Ron said. "I was going to say significant." "Spectacular," Ron repeated, and Hermione almost smiled. Neville definitely did. Harry looked at the phone box, and then he pressed the entry code and they went down. The ministry atrium was already busy despite the hour, people streaming in for the working day, the golden fountain gleaming at the center, the memos in paper airplane form darting through the air in formations that always made Harry think of very bureaucratic birds. He walked through it without stopping, without looking for trouble, without announcing himself, and people noticed him anyway because people always did. He heard his name pass through the crowd in a wave. "Potter, that's Potter, is that Harry Potter?" And he let the wave move through without letting it slow him down. He took the lift down to level 9. The Wizengamot courtrooms occupied a specific wing of level 9 that smelled of old stone and older magic, and the main chamber, courtroom 1, the large circular room where Harry had sat in the defendant's chair at 15, had a visitors' gallery that was technically open to any witch or wizard on session days. Most people never came. Most people didn't know this, which Harry suspected was not accidental. He could hear, before they'd even reached the main corridor, that the session was already in progress. A carrying voice he recognized as Thickness Replacement was reading something procedural from a scroll, the flat administrative voice of someone who had elevated bureaucratic language to a form of camouflage. Harry pushed open the outer door. The usher inside, a short wizard with a neat ministry badge and the look of someone who enforced the rules of an institution the way other people raise children, with exhausted devotion, stepped forward immediately. "I'm sorry, sir, the session is in, I'm aware," Harry said, and handed the man a Gringotts certification card. "Lord Potter Gryffindor Peverell Slytherin Emrys. I have 4 seats on this Wizengamot. I'd like to take them." The usher looked at the card. He looked at Harry. He looked at the rings. He looked at the card again. The card glowed faintly gold along its edges, which was how Gringotts certified documents, a self-confirming enchantment that activated in the presence of the relevant magical signature. The usher stepped aside. The inner door opened. Harry walked in. Courtroom 1 seated approximately 200, arranged in tiered semicircular rows that curved around a central floor space where, at 15, Harry had stood with his hands shaking and tried to explain why he'd used a Patronus in front of a Muggle. The Wizengamot members occupied the upper tiers, 83 of them when at full attendance, in purple robes with silver embroidery, and at the very top, in the presiding chair that was technically neutral but had never once in Harry's experience been occupied by anyone who felt neutral about anything, sat acting Senior Undersecretary Dolores Umbridge. No. Not Umbridge. He looked again. Different person, a thin man with a minister's chain and the pinched look of someone whose power came primarily from controlling who got to enter which room. Acting Chief Warlock Tiberius Ogden's replacement. Someone Harry didn't recognize. But in the second row of the members' tier, 3 seats in from the left, there she was. Umbridge. Pink cardigan, bow in her hair, sitting with her hands folded in her lap like a woman at a garden party, and she was looking at him with an expression that moved through surprise and landed on something Harry recognized. She was calculating. She was already deciding what shape her response would take, already building the architecture of her pushback, and in the calculation he could see the version of her that had written on the back of his hand and smiled while she did it. He made himself look away. He'd get to her. He'd get to all of them. The room had noticed him. The procedural reading had stopped mid-sentence. 83 witches and wizards in purple robes were looking down at him, and Harry walked to the center of the floor, the open space that was usually reserved for defendants and petitioners, and stopped there and looked back up at them. This session is in progress, the acting chief warlock said from the top. His voice had recovered some of its administrative composure. Visitors to the gallery are required to, I'm not a visitor, Harry said. His voice carried well in the circular room, better than he'd expected. He took the Gringotts documents from the satchel Hermione handed him. She and Ron and Neville had arranged themselves at the edge of the floor, just inside the inner door, witnesses and nothing more. I'm Lord Potter Gryffindor-Peverell-Slytherin-Emrys, and I have 4 votes on this body. I'm here to take my seats and conduct a reckoning under the authority of the Lordship of Emrys. He looked up at the acting chief warlock. Sir, I believe the correct procedural response is to formally recognize my presence and pause the session. A murmur moved through the chamber like wind through long grass. Harry could distinguish individual voices in it, disbelief, anger, something that might have been fear, but he focused on the acting chief warlock, who was staring at the Gringotts certifications that Harry had passed to the floor usher, who had carried them up with the particular expression of someone who had just been handed a problem several sizes too large for his job description. These documents, the acting chief warlock started, are certified by Gringotts Bank under the full authority of Director Ragnarok, Harry said. Goblin certification of hereditary title has been recognized as legally binding by the Wizengamot itself under the Magical Inheritance Act of 1742. I have the relevant section cited on page 4 if you need it. Hermione had insisted on page 4. Harry was glad she had. More murmuring. Louder now. He saw Augusta Longbottom in the 3rd tier, a severe woman in a formidable hat, looking from the documents to Harry with an expression that was battling with itself. He saw Lucius Malfoy in the 2nd tier, diminished from his former self, wandless since the battle since he'd been tried and convicted and was currently in what the ministry laughingly called a supervised release, but apparently still permitted his Wizengamot seat, which said something about how this system prioritized things. He saw Malfoy's face and watched surprise move through it and settle into a careful blankness that was the aristocratic equivalent of going very, very still. Lord Potter Emrys. The acting chief warlock tried the title out like a man testing ice on a pond. These are significant claims. Verified claims, Harry said. The distinction matters. The Lordship of Emrys hasn't been activated in 843 years, Harry said. I know. I read the records. He looked around the chamber, deliberately, taking his time, letting them feel the weight of his attention. I didn't come here today to argue about whether this is real. Gringotts has verified it. The magic has confirmed it. He held up his left hand, and the Merlin ring caught the torchlight in a way that seemed slightly beyond what physics should have allowed, not glowing exactly, but present, in a way that made the eye come back to it. What I'm here to do is invoke the reckoning, and I need you all to understand what that means before I do it, because I believe in informed consent. Even for this. Someone in the upper tiers laughed, a short, sharp sound that was meant to signal dismissal. Harry didn't look for who it was. He kept his eyes moving steadily around the chamber. A reckoning, under the Emery's Compact, Harry said, is a binding review of this body's ethical and magical legitimacy. It reviews actions taken, decisions made, and justice denied over a defined period. I'm defining the period as 20 years, beginning with the first documented evidence of the Wizengamot suppression of reports about Voldemort's activities and ending with the Battle of Hogwarts. He paused. I want you to understand, I'm not doing this because I'm angry. I'm doing it because people died. People who wouldn't have died if this body had done its job. And nobody has answered for that. Not one of you has stood up and answered for that. The chamber was quieter now. The murmuring had dropped to almost nothing. I'll give you the opportunity to object to the procedure, Harry said. Formally. If anyone here believes the reckoning is being invoked improperly, you may say so now, and I'll hear you. Silence for 3 seconds. Then Umbridge raised her hand. Of course she did. Yes, Harry said, and the flatness in his voice was the most powerful thing in the room. Umbridge stood, smoothed her cardigan, and smiled the smile that Harry had once thought was the most dangerous smile in the world, the one that looked like pleasantness and was made entirely of threat. While it's lovely to see you again, Mr. Potter, Lord Potter Emerys, Harry said. If we're doing this procedurally, we do it properly. A tiny tightening around her eyes. The Lordship of Emerys, even if legitimate, carries authorities that were designed for a vastly different political context. The magical world of Merlin's era had no ministry, no Wizengamot, no established, it had no established system, no, Harry said. It had chaos and feudalism and warlords with wands. Merlin built the first magical compact specifically to prevent that. The Emerys Lordship exists to ensure the compact is honored. The compact's first principle is that magical governance exists to protect magical people, not to serve itself. He looked at her directly for the first time. Would you like to argue that this body has upheld that principle, Madam Umbridge? In the last 20 years. Specifically? Umbridge's smile went very thin. I can be specific, Harry said. I have 18 pages of specifics if you'd like to discuss them. She sat down. Anyone else? Harry asked. 2 more members stood, raised objections, procedural, both of them, and both of them dismantled by Harry with references to the documents that Hermione had compiled and the legal history that Sharpclaw had walked him through for 3 hours on Wednesday afternoon. They were not stupid men. Their objections were not frivolous. Harry answered them seriously, because dismissing them would have been too easy, and easy answers here would give everyone the sense that something had been gotten away with rather than resolved. It took 40 minutes and he stood in the center of the floor for all of it, and didn't move, and didn't sit, and didn't raise his voice. By the end of it he could see people in the upper tiers doing their own calculations, running their own assessments, and the ones who were doing that were the ones who understood that the objections were failing. Then we proceed, Harry said. Under Emery's compact authority, I invoke the reckoning. I am invoking it now. He felt the rings respond. All 4 of them, simultaneously, warming against his fingers, and the Merlin ring did something that he hadn't felt it do before, it pulsed. Once, deep, like a second heartbeat. The runes on the chamber floor, which Harry had noticed when he first walked in but hadn't drawn attention to, because they were old and obscured by generations of scuff marks and he hadn't wanted anyone else to notice them before he was ready, those runes lit up. Blue-white, like the circles in the Gringotts ritual room. The chamber erupted. Not calmly, not with the contained concern of people managing a difficult situation. It erupted the way a room erupts when something happens that breaks the category of things people have prepared for. People stood. People shouted. 2 members made for their wands. Harry didn't look at the ones going for wands. He looked at the runes and extended his sense of them, and he felt the Emery's lordship engaged like a key finding a lock that had been waiting for it for 800 years. He spoke in a voice that was his own but also something more than his own. Ragnarok had warned him about this, that the invocation of the reckoning would draw on the full authority of the lordship, and that it would feel borrowed but belong to him entirely. By the authority of the Emery's compact, I call the reckoning. Let the record of this body stand before its founding purpose. Let those who served it faithfully be recognized, and let those who corrupted it be called to account. The runes went from blue-white to gold. Harry felt the magic move through him in a wave that was not painful, nothing like the claiming ritual. This was different, this was purposeful, a river that knew where it was going. He felt it radiate outward from him, and he felt it touch each member of the Wizengamot, felt the specific texture of each person's magical signature like a fingerprint, and felt the Emery's magic make its assessment. It was not arbitrary. That was the thing Harry hadn't entirely understood until this moment. He thought the stripping would be his choice, his judgment, his decision about who deserved what. But the Emery's compact was older and more sophisticated than that. The reckoning worked on evidence. On record. On the actual documented reality of what each person had done or failed to do. Harry was the instrument, but the authority was the compact's own, 800 years of magical law operating through him with the precision of something that had been designed for exactly this situation. He felt it reach Dolores Umbridge. The assessment took no time at all. Her record was extensive and unambiguous: the torture of minors, the suppression of evidence, the persecution of Muggleborns, the deployment of Dementors against civilians, the calculated abuse of institutional authority over decades. The compact looked at it the way a court looks at an uncontested evidentiary record. Then it moved to the others. 26 members of the current Wizengamot whose records, when examined by the compact's framework, met the threshold of fundamental magical malfeasance, not incompetence, not poor judgment, not political cowardice, but deliberate and documented wrongdoing against the people they were meant to serve. The gold light intensified. Harry felt the moment before it happened, a breath of stillness, the eye of it, and then he felt the Emery's compact do what it had been designed to do, and what it hadn't done in 843 years. 26 witches and wizards in purple robes felt their magic go quiet. It happened differently for each of them, he would realize later when he thought about it. For some it was sudden, a snuffing out, like a candle under a dome. For others it was gradual, a few seconds of diminishment before it settled. For Umbridge, who was powerful in the specific, vicious way of someone who had spent decades cultivating institutional authority into something that felt like magic even when it wasn't, for Umbridge it was a recognition, and her eyes went wide with it, and then her face went through something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief but lived in a territory between. She raised her wand hand. Nothing happened. She looked at her wand. Then she looked at Harry. Temporary or permanent, Harry said, quietly enough that it wasn't for the room, just for her. That's at my discretion, under the compact. Yours will be temporary. 6 months. When it returns, you'll have the opportunity to present yourself to the new court for review. He held her gaze. I want you to understand that this isn't revenge. I know you think it is. But it isn't. Something moved across her face that he couldn't categorize. I know what revenge feels like, Harry said. This isn't it. The chamber was chaos and he moved through it with an eerie calm, and Hermione and Ron and Neville had stayed at the edge of the floor and were watching, Ron with his arms folded looking like someone watching something he'd always expected to happen, Hermione with tears she was refusing to let fall and the expression of someone witnessing something they'd spent years hoping was possible, Neville with his eyes fixed on the upper tiers where Augusta Longbottom sat rigid and unchanged. She was not among the 26, which Harry had known, she was difficult and blunt and frequently wrong about methods, but her record was clean, and where Lucius Malfoy sat. Harry turned to look at Lucius Malfoy. Malfoy was among the 26. Had been, in some ways, the inevitable center of it, decades of Wizengamot manipulation, evidence suppression in Death Eater trials including his own first one, documented bribery, his role in the diary and what it had done to Ginny Weasley. The compact had assessed him in the same way it had assessed the others. His magic sat quiet in him now. Malfoy met Harry's eyes across the chamber, and his face showed nothing, no fear, no pleading, just the blankness of a man who had spent his whole life preparing for exactly this scenario, the loss of power, the fall, and had always assumed it would come with chains and Azkaban rather than a 17-year-old boy standing in the center of his parliament wearing 4 rings and looking at him like he was simply one more item on a list. Which was, Harry realized, somehow more devastating than chains would have been. The remaining members of this body, Harry said, raising his voice back to chamber volume, are not dismissed. You are not under sanction. The Wizengamot as an institution will continue, and the reckoning does not dissolve it. What it does is remove those whose presence has been found incompatible with the compact's founding purpose. He looked around the room, 57 members still sitting with their magic intact, many of them pale, many of them clearly terrified, a few of them with expressions that Harry was surprised to find looked almost like relief. I'm not here to run this country. I want you to know that. I'm going to establish a review court under the Merlin Compact to create the process for replacing the removed seats, and then I'm going to sit in my 4 seats and do exactly what they're designed for, oversight. Challenge. Veto, when it's warranted. He paused. Not governance. That's yours. But you're going to do it properly, and I am going to be in this room to make sure of it. In the gallery above, which had filled significantly during the session, news of what was happening spreading through the ministry with the speed that only truly scandalous developments achieved, Harry could see faces pressing at the rail. Ministry workers, off-duty Aurors, a few reporters. One of them had a quick quotes quill going at tremendous speed. Good, Harry thought. Let them write it. He turned to the acting chief warlock, who had not been among the 26 and who was sitting in his chair with the look of a man who had just watched an avalanche and was still working out that he was not under it. I'd recommend adjourning for today, Harry said. I'll submit the formal paperwork for my seats by end of business. The documentation for the review court will follow within the week. The acting chief warlock opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, in a voice that was remarkably steady for someone in his situation, session adjourned. People moved. They moved the way people move when a very large thing has just happened and the body responds before the mind catches up, some quickly, some slowly, some standing in place looking at things that weren't there. Harry watched the 26 affected members process out of the chamber with a range of responses. 2 were crying, quietly, one woman pressing her hands flat against her robes as if checking that she was still there. 3 or 4 were visibly furious. The majority were simply contained, and Harry suspected contained fury was going to be the primary political reality of the next few months. Lucius Malfoy walked past Harry on his way to the exit. He stopped. Harry waited. You've made enemies today, Malfoy said. His voice had the quality of something said by rote, a formula that politics had worn into his tongue. I had enemies, Harry said. Now I just have a different arrangement with them. Malfoy looked at him with those pale, still eyes, and something passed across his face that wasn't quite assessment and wasn't quite hate and might have been, under several other layers, something that was working out what it meant to not be the most powerful person in a room anymore. Then he walked away. Augusta Longbottom did not walk away. She descended from the 3rd tier with the purposeful stride of a woman who had once repelled 3 Death Eaters from her own house and considered it a Wednesday. She stopped in front of Harry with her hat at a militant angle and said, "That was the most irregular proceeding I have witnessed in 42 years of attending this chamber." I know, Harry said. The documentation is sound, she said, clipping the words. I had Millicent Bagnold examine the Gringotts certification when she came in. She was lead legal for the ministry in the 80s, and she said it's watertight. I want you to know I verified rather than assumed. That's sensible, Harry said. Don't be glib. Her eyes were sharp and brown and she looked at him the way she sometimes looked at Neville, as if she was seeing something she expected not to be surprised by and was surprised by anyway. What you've done today cannot be undone. I know that too. The people you stripped will organize. The ones who kept their magic will be watched by them. The international magical community will have opinions. The press will, she stopped. Reassembled. You haven't thought about any of that, have you? I've thought about all of it, Harry said. I just decided to do it anyway. Augusta Longbottom was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a slightly different voice, not softer exactly, but differently textured, like stone that had been in sun, my son is in St. Mungo's. He has been for 16 years. 3 of the people you stripped today sat on the Wizengamot panel that reviewed his case and determined that no further investigation into his treatment was warranted. She paused. I never found the right mechanism to challenge that ruling. Harry looked at her carefully. You've made a new mechanism, she said. Don't waste it. She nodded at him in a way that was as close to acknowledgement as he suspected she came, and then she walked past him and out, and he heard her say to Neville as she passed, Close your mouth, Neville, you look like a codfish. Sorry, Gran, Neville said. Harry turned to find his 3 friends watching him from the edge of the floor, which was now nearly empty. The runes had dimmed back to invisibility. The chamber felt different, larger, somehow, or maybe just more honest about its size. Ron was grinning in the specific way that meant he'd been suppressing it for a while and couldn't anymore. Hermione had pressed her knuckles to her mouth and was staring at the ceiling. Are you all right? Harry asked her. She lowered her hand. They never do anything, she said, and the fury in it was so old and specifically shaped that Harry understood immediately what she meant. The Muggleborn Registration Commission, the blood status laws, every time she'd watched the system use its machinery against the people it was supposed to protect, every time she'd been told there were proper channels while people who looked like her were being hunted. They had all this power, and all they ever did was protect themselves with it, and, she stopped. Pressed her knuckles back to her mouth. Then lowered them again with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to finish the sentence. And you just walked in here and didn't. Harry said. She looked at him. He said again. The documentation was yours. The legal framework was yours and Gringotts. I just stood in the middle of a room and held my hand up. You did considerably more than that, Neville said dryly. Harry, Ron said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he'd been thinking about something carefully and had come to a conclusion he wanted to offer carefully. I want you to understand that what just happened is going to be the only thing anyone talks about for the next, I don't know, the rest of our lives, probably, and I'm fully on board. I just want to. He stopped. Are you good? Like, inside? Harry thought about it. Checked himself. Yeah, he said. I'm good. And he was, which surprised him slightly, not elated, not triumphant, not the feverish relief of having gotten away with something. Just solid. Clear. Like a line drawn in the right place. Right, Ron said. Good. Because there are about 12 reporters outside. Harry looked at the chamber doors, then at his hands, the 4 rings. He thought about what Ragnarok had said, about the Emery's reckoning existing for exactly this kind of systemic failure, about the compact's design, about Merlin building something that could survive its creator. He thought about his parents. He thought about Sirius. He thought about Frank and Alice Longbottom, smiling out of a photograph in a house in Derbyshire. Let's go, he said. I'll talk to the reporters. He walked toward the chamber doors, and Hermione fell in beside him and Ron came up on his left and Neville closed it up from behind, and together they pushed through the doors and into the corridor where the reporters were already calling his name, and Harry looked at the crowd of them, quills bristling like a strange forest, cameras flashing, and he felt the 4 rings warm against his skin and thought, all right. This is where it starts. "I'll give you a statement," he said. "One statement, no questions. Ready?" The quills all went vertical. Today the Wizengamot underwent the first Emery's reckoning in 843 years. 26 members were found, under the binding authority of the Merlin Compact, to have engaged in fundamental magical malfeasance against the people they serve. Their magic has been suspended pending review. The institution continues. The work of making it worth continuing starts immediately. He looked directly at the nearest camera, because Hermione had told him to always look at the camera when he wanted to be quoted directly, and said the last part plainly. This wasn't about power. It was about the people who didn't have any. It was always about them. He walked through the crowd, and they parted for him, and he didn't stop. Behind him, distantly, he heard Rita Skeeter's voice say, "Did he just," and then the rest of it was swallowed by the general noise of the corridor, but he caught Hermione's expression in his peripheral vision and she was trying not to smile and failing comprehensively. Good, Harry thought. Let her write that too. Chapter 3, The Ground After the Storm. The morning after the reckoning, Harry made eggs. It was the most ordinary thing he could think to do, and he needed ordinary with a specific urgency, the way you needed water after a long run. He stood at the stove in Grimmauld Place's kitchen in yesterday's clothes, cracking eggs into a pan while the wireless on the counter ran through what sounded like its fourth consecutive segment on the events at the ministry. A Wizengamot spokesperson whose voice kept cracking under the strain of maintaining professional composure. A legal expert explaining the Emery's compact in terms that suggested she'd found out about it approximately 6 hours ago. A caller who kept saying but who gave him the right until the host moved on. Harry turned the wireless off. Ron came downstairs at 7:30 wearing a Chudley Cannon's shirt and the expression of someone who had slept well and felt slightly guilty about it. He looked at the eggs, poured 2 mugs of tea, set one at Harry's elbow, and sat down without saying anything, which was one of the things Harry had always valued most about Ron Weasley. He understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed keeping. Hermione came down 20 minutes later carrying 3 newspapers, which she set on the table and spread out with the efficiency of a field surgeon triaging patients. The Prophet headline was in letters so large they were practically architectural: The Reckoning, Lord Potteremry strips 26 Wizengamot members of magic in unprecedented ACT. The Quibbler, which had apparently gone to an emergency second printing, read, We Told You So, and also, Harry Potter, Merlin Reborn. A paper Harry didn't recognize, small, independent, printed on slightly irregular parchment, had the quietest headline of the 3, The System Failed. Someone finally said so. That third one, Harry said, nodding at it. The Magical Standard, Hermione said. It's been running since the war. Small circulation, mostly Muggleborns and half-bloods. They've been documenting ministry corruption for 2 years with nobody paying attention. She paused. They'll have a larger circulation by tomorrow. Make sure someone from their team gets access when we set up the review court, Harry said. Hermione made a note without being asked. They ate. Outside, Grimmauld Place was quiet, but Harry knew that wouldn't hold. He'd already received 11 owls before breakfast, which he'd identified by species and urgency and sorted into 3 piles: respond today, respond this week, and what Hermione called the diplomatically challenging pile, which was currently taller than the other 2 combined. The knock at the front door came at 9. It was Draco Malfoy. Harry opened the door himself, which he suspected was not what Malfoy had expected, because Malfoy's composed opening expression flickered for just a fraction of a second before reassembling. He was in grey robes, good ones but not ostentatious, and he looked like he hadn't slept, not in the red-eyed, disheveled way, but in the rigid, over-controlled way of someone who had decided that if he was going to be awake all night he was going to be awake with excellent posture. Harry looked at him. Malfoy looked at Harry. You stripped my father's magic, Malfoy said. The compact did, Harry said. Based on his record. Don't split that hair with me, Malfoy said, and there was an edge under it that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief and was absolutely both. You invoked it. You chose to invoke it. I did, Harry said. They looked at each other, and Harry didn't move from the doorway, and Malfoy didn't step back from it, and the space between them had the quality of something being negotiated without either of them explicitly negotiating. He can't do anything, Malfoy said. He can't perform magic. He can barely. He sat at the table this morning and couldn't light a candle, and he looked at his hands like, he stopped. Pressed his jaw closed. Opened it again. I want you to know I'm not here to ask you to reverse it. I know you won't. I know the compact doesn't work that way. I read the Emery's documentation last night. You found documentation on the Emery's compact last night, Harry said. I grew up in a house with 12,000 books, Malfoy said flatly. Finding documentation is not my limitation. Harry stepped back from the door. Come in. Malfoy walked into Grimmauld Place with the expression of someone entering enemy territory who had decided that acknowledging it would be beneath them. He followed Harry through the hall and into the kitchen, where Ron immediately looked at the ceiling and Hermione looked at Malfoy with the specific focus of someone who had decided to be professionally civil about this even if it killed her. Granger, Malfoy said. Malfoy, she said. Weasley, he said. You've got a nerve, Ron said, which was not unfriendly so much as factual. Malfoy sat down at the kitchen table with the air of someone who sat at kitchen tables every day and had no feelings about this particular one. Harry sat across from him and poured him tea without asking because the alternative was standing in his own kitchen holding a teapot, which felt worse. Tell me why you're here, Harry said. Malfoy wrapped his hands around the mug, didn't drink from it, just held it, and looked at Harry with an expression that was stripped of most of its usual architecture. No performative disdain. No cultivated superiority. Something more raw than that, and Harry could see how much it cost him to let it be visible. Because I've been thinking since last night about who to go to, and you're the only one with the actual authority to do anything. Which I find, he paused. Deeply irritating, if you want the truth. I usually do, Harry said. My father's on a 6-month suspension, Malfoy said. The other 25 are also on suspension, or permanent, depending on their assessment. Do you know what 26 suddenly powerless people with nothing but time and wounded pride are going to do? Organize, Harry said. It was what Augusta Longbottom had said. I know. They were already meeting this morning, Malfoy said. My father's study. 8 of them, before I left. I don't know what they're planning and he didn't tell me, which means whatever it is, he doesn't want me to have a choice about it. He does that, something in his voice shifted, went quieter. When he's going to do something he thinks I'd object to, he doesn't tell me. So I can't object. Harry looked at him. You came here to warn me. I came here, Malfoy said precisely, because I want the review court you're setting up to work. Because if it works, and if my father goes through it properly, and if the 6 months means something, then there's a path through this that doesn't end with him doing something stupid and permanent. He met Harry's eyes. I know what he is. I'm not asking you to pretend he isn't. I'm asking you to give me the chance to manage it. Because I can, if you don't give him a reason to burn everything down. The kitchen was quiet. Harry heard Ron shift in his chair. He didn't look at Ron or Hermione. He kept his eyes on Malfoy. The version of himself that had walked into the Wizengamot yesterday had been prepared for this, not this specifically, but the general shape of it, the thing where your action has consequences that aren't clean, that arrive at your kitchen table at 9 in the morning wearing grey robes and asking you to think about what you've set in motion. He'd known it was coming. He'd done it anyway. Both those things could be true. I'll give you access to the review court process, Harry said. Not special access, the same access anyone has to present a case for a suspended member's reinstatement. You can build his case and present it properly when the time comes. He paused. But I need something from you. Malfoy's expression was watchful. What? Information, Harry said. Not secrets you don't have. Not betrayal for its own sake. If your father or any of the others are planning something that will hurt people, I need to know about it in time to prevent it. You come to me, or you come to Hermione, and we deal with it before it gets past the point of dealing." Malfoy was quiet for a long moment. Harry watched him process the offer, not the political calculation of it, which Malfoy could probably run in his sleep, but something more personal. The shape of what it meant to sit at Harry Potter's kitchen table and agree to this. "Fine," Malfoy said. He picked up the tea, finally drank from it, and set the mug down. "The tea is terrible, by the way." "Ron made it," Harry said. "I made it fine," Ron said, to the ceiling. Malfoy left 40 minutes later, and the three of them sat for a moment in the wake of his departure. Ron said, "I feel like I need to recalibrate something about the world." "He's not a good person," Hermione said carefully, "but he might be a useful one. And he's not wrong about his father organizing. He's also not entirely wrong about wanting a path that doesn't end in more damage," Harry said. He stood, stacked the plates. "We need to move. I've got the Gringotts meeting at 11 to start the review court documentation, and before that I want to talk to Kingsley." Kingsley Shacklebolt had been serving as interim minister for magic since the battle, a role he occupied with the competence of someone who had always been more qualified for it than whoever held it officially, and the particular dignity of a man who had seen enough chaos to know that steadiness was itself a form of power. He met Harry at the ministry, not in the atrium, but in his own office, which was large and unadorned in a way that felt deliberate, like someone who'd been given a big room and decided the size of the room didn't need any help announcing itself. He was not angry. Harry had braced slightly for anger. The reckoning had, after all, sent the minister's workplace into what was diplomatically called significant disruption, but Kingsley was not an angry man. He was a man who responded to significant events by going very quiet and considering them from several directions, and that was what he did now, sitting across his desk from Harry with his hands folded and his expression the careful neutral of someone constructing their actual thoughts before offering them. "Walk me through the legal basis," Kingsley said. "All of it." Harry walked him through it. Kingsley listened without interrupting, which Harry appreciated, and asked 3 questions when Harry was done, precise, specific questions that went to the exact joints of the framework, the places where it could be challenged. Harry answered them from Hermione's documentation, from Sharpclaw's briefing, from his own understanding of the compact which had been deepening since Thursday like a river finding its level. Kingsley was quiet for a moment after the last answer. "You know what the international response is going to be," he said. "I have guesses," Harry said. "The ICW will be convening an emergency session," Kingsley said. 3 delegations have already requested formal contact with my office. France and Germany are cautiously supportive. The United States is," he paused, "characteristically certain that this is somehow a sovereignty issue regarding them, despite having no connection to it whatsoever." Harry smiled slightly. "There are others who are less cautious," Kingsley said. "There are governments in the international magical community who look at what happened yesterday and see a precedent they very much do not want established. A 17-year-old boy walking into a governing body and stripping its members of their power is," he chose his words. "It can be read as liberation or as coup, depending on where you're standing." "I know," Harry said. "I need the ministry's formal recognition of the Emry's Lordship's authority. Not support, recognition. The distinction matters," Kingsley said, with something that was almost a smile. "I've been told." "Yes. The ministry's formal recognition is something I can move through official channels within the week. It's legally straightforward, given the Gringotts certification." He looked at Harry with that particular quality of assessment that Harry had noticed in the Order. Kingsley had always had the ability to look at a situation and read not just what was happening but what kind of thing it was. "Harry. Are you all right?" "People keep asking me that," Harry said. "It's a good question," Kingsley said. Harry thought about it in the same way he'd thought about it when Ron asked, actually checking, rather than deflecting. "I'm clear," he said. "I'm not, I didn't do this in a fury and I'm not regretting it and I'm not afraid of what comes next." I'm aware that it's complex and I'm prepared to do the work. He paused. Is that all right? Kingsley looked at him for a moment. It's more than all right, he said quietly. It's what we needed. The afternoon was meetings, Sharpclaw at Gringotts to begin drafting the review court charter, a 30-minute discussion with a Wizengamot legal archivist who had appeared at Grimmauld Place with 6 scrolls and the expression of a person delivering something they suspected might be important. A call via enchanted mirror with a journalist from the Magical Standard who asked questions so pointed and well-researched that Harry found himself answering them with more detail than he'd intended. Her name was Priya Kapoor. She'd been running the paper for 2 years on essentially no resources and an absolute conviction that documentation was the only thing that made justice possible, and by the end of the conversation Harry had decided she should be on the review court's press liaison list and told her so. She said, I'm not going to stop being critical if you do something I think is wrong. I'd find it more worrying if you did, Harry said. She said she'd be in touch, and cut the mirror. Neville arrived at Grimmauld Place at 5, which had been planned. Harry had asked him that morning to come, but there was something in the way he arrived that was different from the day before. He came in quickly, with energy, with the specific forward momentum of someone who'd been thinking hard all day about a thing he wanted to say. I want a seat on the review court, Neville said, before Harry had fully closed the door. Not as a favor. I know why I should have one. The Longbottom family was directly affected by the corruption your reckoning addressed. My parents' case was mishandled at every level, the investigation into who ordered the attack was closed improperly, and I have spent my entire life watching the system handle it badly. I have standing. I have motivation. And I have, he stopped, gathered himself. I've been thinking about what I can actually do. Not one fight. Not, I can do that, we both know I can do that, but that's not, I want to help rebuild it. The court. The process. I want to be part of making it work. Harry looked at him. Neville Longbottom at 17, who had pulled a sword out of a hat, who had stood in front of Voldemort and refused to break, who had run an underground resistance out of a castle for a year while Harry was hunting Horcruxes in a tent. Who had always been braver than anyone gave him credit for and had spent years letting the underestimation sit on him like a coat he hadn't chosen. Not anymore. I was going to ask you, Harry said. I was going to ask today. I just wanted you to come to it yourself. Neville blinked. You were waiting for me to, you needed to say it, Harry said. There's a difference between being asked and choosing. You should choose. Something shifted in Neville's face, not dramatically, not with great show. Just a quiet settling, like something finding its right place after a long time of being slightly wrong. All right, he said. Yes. I choose. They had dinner together, all 4 of them, at the long kitchen table, and it was the first dinner since the battle that felt something other than provisional. Not celebratory. Harry wasn't in a celebratory mood, and he thought he'd probably feel suspicious of himself if he was, but present. Like they were actually occupying the moment they were in rather than bracing for the next thing. Ron asked Hermione to pass the bread and she did, and their hands touched briefly on the loaf and Ron looked at his plate and Hermione looked at the ceiling and Neville looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had noticed and was filing it for future reference. You should just say it, Harry told Ron. Say what? Ron said. Harry looked at Hermione. She was looking at her plate. But she was smiling. Never mind, Harry said, and ate his dinner. The owl arrived at 9:30, when they'd moved to the sitting room and Hermione had built a fire with her wand without thinking and then looked at it like she'd forgotten she could do that and felt suddenly luminous about it. The owl was large, officious looking, bearing the seal of the International Confederation of Wizards on its letter and the demeanor of a bird that had been specifically selected for its imposing qualities. Harry read the letter. Read it again. What is it? Hermione asked. The ICW wants a meeting, he said. Full formal session. They want me to appear before them and justify the reckoning under international magical law. He set the letter on the arm of the chair. They're giving me 2 weeks. That could be very good or very bad, Hermione said. It's a stage, Neville said thoughtfully. If you go and you win the argument there, it becomes international precedent, Hermione finished, and her eyes were already doing that thing where they went slightly distant and Harry could see the architecture of her thinking as clearly as if she were drawing it in the air. Not just for Britain. For every magical government with the same structural corruption. Which is most of them, Harry said. Which is most of them, Hermione agreed. 2 weeks, Ron said. We need to prepare. We'll prepare, Harry said. He meant it simply, but the fire was warm and the letter sat on the arm of his chair and the 4 of them in that room felt like the beginning of something with actual edges to it, something that had a shape. Outside, London went about its ordinary evening. Inside the sitting room, 4 people who had survived extraordinary things were deciding, quietly and without ceremony, to build something with the survival. The knock at the door came at 10. Harry answered it expecting another owl, or a ministry runner, or possibly a journalist who had tracked down the address through means he'd address later. He was not expecting Draco Malfoy again, and he said so. I know, Malfoy said. His composure from the morning was different now, less constructed, more pressured, like something had been leaning on it all day and left marks. My father left the house at 7 this evening. He took 3 of the others with him. I don't know where he went. Harry absorbed this. You're telling me now. I followed him to Knockturn Alley, Malfoy said. He went into a shop that shouldn't be open, closed since the war, supposedly, sells objects of, it's the kind of shop that deals in things that don't require magic to use. He held Harry's gaze steadily. Things that can hurt people regardless of whether you have a wand. Harry stepped back from the door again. Come in. Malfoy came in again, into the hallway, and stopped. He looked at Harry and said something that was clearly costing him something. I know that I am not, that you have no reason to trust this. That the smart play for me, politically, is to let whatever my father is planning run and manage the fallout. I know that. His jaw was tight. I'm telling you anyway. Why? Harry asked. Genuinely asking. Malfoy was quiet for a moment. Because I'm done, he said. With all of it. With the managing, and the calculating, and the next move, and what the family does. I'm done. He said it not as a revelation but as a conclusion, like something he'd been arriving at for a while and had finally reached. He's going to do something that hurts someone and I don't want it to happen and you're the one who can stop it. So here I am. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he called up the hall, Neville. We need you. Neville appeared in the hall doorway, took in Malfoy, and his expression did the controlled neutrality thing. Malfoy. I need you and Ron to go to Knockturn Alley, Harry said. Closed shop, east side, Malfoy will give you the name. Don't engage, just observe and report back. Hermione, she appeared beside Neville. Get me Kingsley's mirror contact. Already getting it, she said, and was gone. Malfoy gave Neville the shop name in 3 words, flat, direct, no editorializing. Neville nodded and went to find Ron without any further discussion, which Harry noticed Malfoy seemed slightly thrown by, as if he'd expected more argument. They trust you, Malfoy said. Yes, Harry said. Why? Harry considered various answers to this and settled on the simplest. Because I trust them. It goes both directions. Malfoy looked at him with an expression Harry couldn't fully read, something thoughtful in it, and something that might have been, in a person with fewer defenses, something like longing. Malfoy said, which was not a word so much as a noise, and turned to look at the hallway wall. Harry left him there and went to find Hermione, and behind him Grimmauld Place hummed with the specific energy of people who had decided that the night was not done yet and had things to do in it. Outside, the city pressed on, ordinary and unaware, and the ground after the storm was damp and full of new things pushing up through it, and in Knockturn Alley a former Death Eater was doing something in a shop that shouldn't be open, and the night had at least 3 more hours in it and Harry was, he realized, not tired at all. He was awake in the specific way that mattered. The way that meant something. He went to work. Chapter 4, The Merlin Accord. Ron and Neville came back at midnight. Harry heard them before he saw them, the specific sound of two people moving quickly through the front door and trying not to sound like they were moving quickly, which produced its own distinctive rhythm. He was in the study with Hermione and Malfoy, the three of them spread across various chairs with documents between them, working through the legal framework for the review court with the focused silence of people who had set aside whatever they felt about each other in favor of the immediate problem. Malfoy had been, Harry noted, genuinely useful. He knew the Wizengamot's internal procedures in the specific way of someone who had grown up hearing them discussed at dinner as tools rather than abstractions, and twice in the last hour he'd identified procedural gaps in Hermione's draft charter that she'd acknowledged with the clipped precision of someone who hated being wrong and respected being corrected. Ron came into the study first. His expression said enough before the words did, not alarm, not crisis, but the particular look of someone carrying information that was going to complicate things. Three of them were in the shop, he said. Lucius, Avery, and a woman we didn't recognize. The shop does exactly what Malfoy said, non-magical objects, specialty items, things that work without a wand. He sat down. They were buying communication devices. Old ones. Pre-ministry, no magical signature. The kind that can't be tracked by the standard detection spells. Untraceable communication, Hermione said. Between who? Harry asked. That's the part, Neville said from the doorway. He'd taken his coat off somewhere en route and was holding a folded piece of parchment. We followed Avery afterward. He went to the Owl post office in Diagon Alley, the late-night counter, and sent a letter. I got a look at the address. He held out the parchment. Harry took it. Read the address written there in Neville's handwriting. Then he looked up. Geneva, he said. That's the ICW's administrative address. The room processed that. They're already in contact with the international community, Hermione said. Before the ICW's formal letter even reached you. They're building a case. Building opposition, Malfoy said. He was looking at the parchment in Harry's hand with an expression that was not entirely surprised, and the quality of his non-surprise was itself information. My father has contacts in the European magical governments going back 30 years. If he's reaching out through untraceable channels, he's not appealing to anyone who would respond through official ones. Which governments? Harry asked. Malfoy met his eyes. This was the moment, Harry thought, the line between information sharing as pragmatism and information sharing as something else. He watched Malfoy make the calculation and watched him, after a moment, step across it. Bulgaria has a contingent that's been resistant to any oversight reform since Grindelwald. Parts of the French magical government, not the official position, the interior factions. And there's a bloc in the ICW's Eastern European Council that has been protecting its own version of the same corrupt structures your reckoning disrupted here. Malfoy paused. They won't want the precedent. If Emery's authority can be invoked in Britain, someone might invoke it elsewhere. Someone should, Neville said. Yes, well, Malfoy said. The people who'd be stripped of power don't tend to share that view. Harry set the parchment down. The fire had burned lower while they'd been talking, and the study had gone dimmer without anyone noticing. He looked at the documents spread across the table, the review court charter in draft, the Emery's compact documentation, the ICW letter with its 2-week deadline, and thought about the shape of what he was dealing with. The reckoning had been the easy part. Not simple, not painless, but structurally easy. He'd identified a problem, he'd had the authority and the power to address it, and he'd done it. What came after was harder, because what came after was the long, patient, unglamorous work of building something in the place where the broken thing had been, while the people who'd benefited from the broken thing organized in the dark with untraceable owls. He needed the review court established before the ICW session. That was the critical thing. If he walked into Geneva with the compact invoked but no structure yet in place, the opposition could argue he'd created a power vacuum rather than a reform. If he walked in with a functioning court and a documented process, the argument became significantly harder to make. How long to finalize the charter? He asked Hermione. She looked at her draft. 3 days if I work solidly. 2, Harry said. I'll help. You'll slow me down, she said, not unkindly. Get sharp claw. He knows the legal precedents I'd spend time looking up. Done. Neville, I'll handle the member selection for the court, Neville said. He'd clearly been thinking about this. We need people with standing and credibility. People the affected communities will trust. I have names. Give them to me tomorrow morning, Harry said. Malfoy, he looked at Draco, who looked back with the expression of someone waiting to find out what category they'd been assigned to. I need you to write down everything you know about the ICW contacts your father might use. Not guesses, what you actually know. Meetings you witnessed, names you heard, correspondence you saw. Whatever you have. Malfoy was quiet for a beat. That's a significant document to produce. I know, Harry said. Is it something you can do? Another beat. Yes, Malfoy said. Then go home and start, Harry said. Come back tomorrow evening. Malfoy stood, straightened his robes, and looked around the room, at Ron, at Neville, at Hermione with her draft charter, at the fire and the documents and the particular organized chaos of people working on something that mattered. His expression did something complicated that Harry decided not to try to name. You're all genuinely very strange, Malfoy said, and left. Ron looked at the closed door. I'm choosing to take that as a compliment, he said. Harry slept 4 hours. He was up before 6, at the kitchen table with his copy of the Emery's compact documentation and a pot of tea, reading for the 3rd time the section that had been occupying the back of his mind since the Gringotts meeting, the section Sharpclaw had summarized but that Harry wanted to understand fully, in its own words, without translation. The compact was written in a version of English old enough that certain words had shifted meaning, but the general architecture of it was clear. And the architecture had a piece he hadn't fully reckoned with. When he'd claimed the Emery's lordship, he'd accepted the authority to convene the reckoning. He'd known that. What he'd understood less completely was the second obligation, the one that followed from the reckoning, implicit in the compact's logic, stated in language that was direct to the point of being blunt even across 8 centuries. He who strips the corrupt body of its power takes upon himself the obligation to establish in its place a body worthy of the compact's purpose. This is not a courtesy. This is a condition of the lordship itself. Harry read it again. Then he set the document down and sat with his tea and thought about that. Not the political implications, he'd already moved on those, the review court, the charter, all of it. He thought about the personal dimension of it. The compact wasn't giving him an option. It was telling him, in the plainest possible terms, that he hadn't just broken something. He'd become responsible for what replaced it. Not as a choice he could make or decline. As a condition of who he now was. He thought about Dumbledore, who had spent decades holding the Wizengamot at arm's length, using his influence to moderate and redirect rather than fundamentally change. He thought about how many times the old man had known the system was rotten and had worked around the rot rather than cutting it out, because cutting it out meant becoming responsible for what came after. He thought about whether that was wisdom or fear and whether the distinction mattered when people kept dying either way. He was still thinking about it when the compact itself seemed to respond. That was the only way he could describe it. The Merlin ring, on his right hand, went warm in a way that was different from the ambient warmth it had held since the claiming, specific, directed, like a hand on a shoulder. And then Harry felt something unfold in his awareness like a room he hadn't known was there opening its door. He sat very still. The room in his awareness was not metaphorical. It was the compact itself, or rather, it was the architectural record of the compact, centuries of precedent, decision, obligation and fulfillment, every time the compact had been active in any form, every invocation of its lesser authorities by the various emeries claimants who had held partial forms of the lordship without meeting the full threshold. There were more of them than Sharpclaw had implied, 14 across the centuries, none of whom had met all three conditions, each of whom had accessed a fragment. And at the center of all of it was something that felt less like a record and more like a presence. Harry wasn't superstitious. He'd dealt with enough genuine magic to know that the line between superstition and reality was less fixed than Hermione's epistemology preferred, but he was also not someone who heard voices or saw visions as a general rule. The Horcrux had given him flashes of Voldemort, but that had been a piece of another soul in his head, which was a specific and well-documented mechanism. This was different. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a vision. It was more like thought. Thought that wasn't his own, but that arrived in the right language, organized in the right way for him to understand it. Like reading a letter written for you by someone who knew you well. The court you are building, it said, or felt, or communicated in whatever sense applied. It must be bound to the compact, not to your authority. You understand the distinction. Harry did understand it, which surprised him. The distinction was critical. A court bound to his authority would dissolve if his authority was ever challenged or transferred. A court bound to the compact itself would outlast him. The founding requires witnesses from all 4 bloodlines you hold, it continued. Gryffindor requires a representative of the original founding families. Peverell requires a Hallow-aware witness. Slytherin requires a Parselmouth present at the binding. Emery's requires, it stopped. Harry waited. A willing sacrifice of something the founder values, it finished. Not symbolic. Real. He sat with that. The tea had gone cold. Outside, London was going grey and early with the beginning of day, pigeons discussing whatever pigeons discussed, a bus going past in the distance. He turned his hand over and looked at the Merlin ring, the dark iridescent band, and thought about what he valued. The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity, as answers sometimes did when you trained yourself to be honest. He valued safety. Specifically, the safety of the people closest to him, the ability to know that his presence kept them from being targets. What the war had taken was that illusion, and what he'd rebuilt in the weeks since the battle was something more pragmatic, the knowledge that he was capable enough to protect them. The new version of safety was competence rather than certainty. What it would mean to sacrifice it. You're up early, Hermione said from the doorway, in her dressing gown with her hair in the state that preceded its morning organization. She looked at him. Then at the documents. Then at his face. What happened? The compact talked to me, Harry said. She came in fully. Sat down across from him, pulled the documentation toward her. Talk to you how? He explained. She listened with the focused attention she gave to things that were genuinely new, not the slightly impatient attention of someone waiting to categorize, but open. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. It makes sense, she said, slowly. The compact was Merlin's. Merlin was, by all historical accounts, not just a powerful wizard but a person of specific philosophical beliefs about the relationship between power and responsibility. If the Lordship is a living magical framework rather than a static one, it would have been designed to, she paused. To teach. To communicate its obligations to whoever held it. The sacrifice, Harry said. The founding requires it. Hermione looked at him carefully. What is it asking for? Harry told her. He watched her face while he did, the slight tightening around her eyes that was her version of alarm, the way she controlled it and folded it into something more considered. That's not nothing, she said. No, he agreed. It would mean the review court's founding is bound to the compact at a cost that's real. Which means it's real. Not political positioning, not bureaucratic architecture. The compact takes it seriously. He looked at the ring. So do I. Harry, I've already decided, he said, not cutting her off but simply telling her where he was. I'm telling you what the decision is, not asking whether to make it. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, tell me how to help with the binding itself, then. If we're doing this properly, we do it properly. They spent the morning on the charter, Harry and Hermione at the kitchen table, Sharpclaw appearing at 9 via flow with a crack that sent Ron sideways into the counter and a mild goblin apology. The charter took shape over 4 hours of close work, Hermione drafting, Sharpclaw flagging legal precedents, Harry making decisions at the structural level about what the court's actual purpose was and how that purpose translated into rules. The court would have 9 members, 3 from affected families, Neville being one, 3 legal experts not previously associated with the ministry, 2 international observers, and 1 rotating seat filled by public application every 2 years. It would have authority to review the suspension cases of the stripped Wizengamot members, to recommend reinstatement or permanent removal, and to investigate any future claims of governmental magical malfeasance. It would not have enforcement authority, that remained with the ministry's Aura department under Kingsley, but its findings would be legally binding on the Wizengamot. It was bound to the Emery's compact rather than to Harry Potter. This is good, Sharpclaw said, looking at the final draft with the expression of someone who had been practicing succession law for 40 years and had developed a connoisseur's appreciation for a well-constructed document. This will hold. When can we formalize it? Harry asked. The founding ritual requires the 4 witnesses as the compact specified, Sharpclaw said. For Gryffindor lineage, Neville, Harry said. The Longbottoms trace to the original Gryffindor founding families. I verified it. Yes. For Peverell, Hallow-aware witness, Luna Lovegood, Hermione said. All 3 of them looked at her. She's seen the Thestrals her whole life. She knows the resurrection stone exists from when Harry used it, and she understands the Hallows in a way Luna understands things that most people don't. Harry thought about Luna in the dungeon at Malfoy Manor, making the darkness less frightening just by speaking in it. Luna, he agreed. Parselmouth at the Slytherin witness, Sharpclaw looked at Harry. That's me, Harry said. The 4th, Sharpclaw said, and stopped. I'll handle the 4th, Harry said. Sharpclaw looked at him with those bright old eyes and chose not to ask the obvious question. The ritual can be performed tomorrow evening if all witnesses are present, he said. I'll prepare the binding documents. Getting Luna was, characteristically, both simpler and stranger than expected. Harry went to the Lovegoods' reconstituted house in Devon that afternoon. Xenophilius had rebuilt it with ministry assistance, a slightly different shape than before, the top floor that had held the Ravenclaw's diadem replica now replaced by a domed observatory, and knocked on the door, and Luna opened it wearing paint-covered robes and an expression of unsurprised delight. Harry, she said. I was expecting you, in the sense that I wasn't expecting you specifically but I was expecting something important. Come in. The house smelled like turpentine and something floral, and the interior had been covered in Luna's paintings, not like a gallery, not arranged for viewing, more like someone had been painting her life and tacked it up to see it from the outside. Harry spotted himself in several of them, always at a slight angle, always with light doing something around him that wasn't quite accurate and was somehow more true for it. He explained the founding requirement. Luna listened, sitting cross-legged on the arm of a chair in the way she sat on things, comfortable in spaces most people would find impractical. The Hallows, she said when he was done. You have all 3. I'm their acknowledged master, Harry said. The Elder Wand is in Dumbledore's tomb, but the mastery is still yours, Luna said. Yes. The wand would know. She looked at him with those wide, dreamy eyes that Harry had always found were less dreamy than they appeared. They moved over things with a precision that the surface effect disguised. What do you have to give, for the founding? He told her. Her expression shifted, very slightly, into something gentle. That must be a complicated thing to decide, she said. Not really, Harry said. The court needs to work. That's what matters. Luna looked at him for a moment and then said, with the directness she deployed when she decided something was important, "You do know, Harry, that you're allowed to also want things for yourself. Not instead of everything else. In addition." He looked at her. "Just for consideration," she said, and hopped off the chair arm. "I'll be there tomorrow evening. What should I wear?" "Whatever you want," Harry said. "Oh good," she said. "I have an idea involving Moonstone." The evening brought Malfoy back, as promised, with a document that was 12 pages in his cramped, precise handwriting: names, dates, relationships, specific communications he'd witnessed, reconstructed conversations, financial connections. Harry read the first 4 pages in the hallway while Malfoy stood with his hands in his pockets and watched him read. "This is thorough," Harry said. "I'm thorough when something matters," Malfoy said. Harry looked up from the document. "Thank you," he said. Simply, without any of the awkward architecture people usually built around gratitude when the relationship was complicated. Malfoy said nothing for a moment. Then, one of the names on page 9. Gellert Brandt, ICW Council, Austrian Delegation. He's the one they'll use as the formal channel. My father's worked with him since before the First War. Malfoy chose his word carefully. He's intelligent. He'll be well prepared when you go to Geneva. He won't make any of the obvious mistakes. What mistakes will he make? Malfoy considered. He believes that power is the only real argument. He'll try to outmaneuver you legally, and when that starts to fail he'll move to force, not violence. He's not stupid, but political force, procedural exclusion, trying to have the session closed or your standing challenged. He paused. He'll underestimate the emotional dimension. He's always done that. Harry filed this. You know him personally. He came to the manor several times when I was younger, Malfoy said. He used to look at me the way the Death Eaters did, like I was furniture that would eventually become useful. He said it flatly, without performance. I didn't like him. Good instinct, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him with a slightly shifted expression. You do that, he said. Do what? Say the thing directly. Without, he made a gesture. Without managing it. I found managing it costs more than it saves, Harry said. Come through. We're finalizing the court documents. The founding ritual took place the following evening in the back garden of Grimmauld Place, which had been a scrubby and neglected space that Hermione had quietly transfigured into something more appropriate over the course of the day without making a project of it, not formal, just cleared and prepared, with the compact specific requirements for the binding space met in practical terms. Neville stood at the north point. Luna stood at the east in robes covered in moonstone beading that caught the early evening light and scattered it in ways that were quietly beautiful. Ron stood at the west as Harry's designated anchor, not a formal witness role, just a person whose job was to be there, which Hermione had added to the charter on her own authority because she'd read about founding rituals and felt anchor witnesses were important. Hermione stood beside Harry. You don't have to watch this part, Harry said quietly. I know, she said, and didn't move. Harry stood at the south point with the charter document and the compact before him, and Sharpclaw at the center with a goblin binding quill, and the evening air was still and the garden was quiet and the 4 rings on Harry's hands were warmer than they'd been since the claiming. He spoke the Parselmouth component of the binding in the old tongue, the words that sealed the Slytherin witness portion, and felt the garden respond to it, the magic older than English, older than this city, older than most of the things they were building on top of. He pressed his hand to the charter document and felt the Emery's compact ask its question, silently, in the way it had communicated with him before. The sacrifice, it said. Freely given. Harry reached into his jacket pocket and took out the invisibility cloak. He held it for a moment. The fabric was cool and impossible against his fingers, that quality of existing slightly sideways from the physical world, something that had been passed from his father to him and had saved his life more times than he could count, that had let him walk through the dark places of the last 7 years unseen. More than protection. Inheritance. The most tangible thread connecting him to James Potter. He laid it on the charter document. The Emery's compact didn't take it. That wasn't the mechanism. The sacrifice wasn't about the object, the cloak would still exist, it would still be the cloak. The sacrifice was about Harry's relationship to it, to what it represented, to the particular comfort of the invisible life. The compact was asking him to give up the option of disappearing when things got hard. To commit to being seen, permanently, for as long as the court needed its founding. He felt it go. Not the cloak, the attachment to it. The safety of it. The version of himself that had worn it to hide. The garden lit up. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical gold of the Wizengamot's runes, softer than that, more like the quality of light at the very end of a clear day, that low golden saturation that makes everything look essential. The charter document sealed itself at all 4 points. Sharpclaw stepped back with the expression of a professional who had witnessed something beyond his category. Luna said, softly, "Oh, that's lovely." Neville said nothing. But Harry caught his face, and it was the face of someone watching something he was going to remember. The court was real. Not political. Not procedural. Real, in the way that Merlin had apparently meant things to be real, bound by cost, witnessed by people who had their own history with what was being built, connected to magic old enough to remember why any of this had mattered in the first place. Harry picked up the cloak and put it back in his pocket. It felt the same. He felt different. "All right," he said. The garden held its light for another moment and then settled back to evening. "We have work to do. Geneva in 12 days. He looked around at them, Hermione with ink on her fingers and her eyes bright, Ron who had been standing at the west point with his arms folded and the exact amount of solemnity the occasion required, Neville who was looking at the sealed charter with something that was going to be important, Luna who was watching a moth that had appeared from nowhere and seemed personally delighted by it. "The Merlin Accord is established," Sharpclaw said formally, from the center of the garden. He sounded like a man who had practiced that sentence in advance and was glad to finally say it. "The Merlin Accord is established," Harry agreed. "Let's go inside. I'll make tea." "Please let someone else make the tea," Ron said. "For the love of, my tea is fine," Harry said. "Your tea," Ron said, following him toward the house, "is an act of aggression against the concept of tea." Behind them, the garden held the last of its light and then let it go, the charter document secure in Sharpclaw's leather case, the accord sealed and real and bound to something older and more patient than any of them, and the evening settled in around the house on Grimmauld Place with the quality of something that had been waiting to begin. Chapter 5, Blood and Ink. The attempt on Harry's life happened on a Wednesday, which he'd always thought was the second most unremarkable day of the week. He was walking back from the ministry alone, which Hermione had told him not to do and which he'd done anyway, because 12 days of being surrounded by people with serious expressions and urgent documents had created in him a specific need for 20 minutes of pavement and open sky. It was early evening, the city going amber at the edges, the Muggle street he'd cut through busy with people coming home from work. He had his hands in his pockets and was thinking about the ICW session and the specific problem of Gellert Brandt and the 12 names on page 9 of Malfoy's document. He felt the curse before he heard it. Not in a mystical way, in the way that years of being a target had built something in him, some peripheral awareness that functioned like a tripwire in his nervous system. He stepped sideways without thinking about it, a single fluid movement, and the killing curse went through the space where his head had been and hit a postbox behind him with a sound like a bell struck badly. The postbox turned black and crumpled and the Muggle woman who'd been approaching it screamed and ran. 2 more Muggles ran. Harry was already moving, not away from the direction the curse had come from but toward it, cutting across the street at an angle, because the instinct that had developed across 6 years of being hunted knew that forward was almost always the better option. There were 2 of them. A man and a woman, both in the kind of Muggle clothes that wizards wore when they were trying not to look like wizards and mostly achieving the opposite. The man had his wand up for a second shot and his face had the specific configuration of someone who had expected to be leaving and was not yet adjusted to the fact that his target was coming at him instead. Harry summoned the man's wand with a gesture that was barely a gesture, a flick, loose wrist, almost casual, and caught it left-handed and kept walking. The woman fired a stunner. Harry deflected it without stopping, directing it downward into the pavement where it left a scorch mark, and then he was close enough that the range for wand work collapsed and he reached out and simply took her wand the same way he'd taken the first one. He stood in front of them with both their wands in one hand and his other hand still in his pocket, and looked at them. They looked back. The man was maybe 40, sharp-featured, the kind of composed that was making an effort. The woman was younger, mid-20s, and the composure was less solid on her. He could see the assessment running behind her eyes, recalculating the scenario she'd walked into. "Hired?" Harry asked. The man said nothing. "That's fine," Harry said. "The Aurors will find out. They're thorough." He looked at them both for a moment. "Here's what I want you to understand. I wasn't afraid of Voldemort. I'm certainly not afraid of whoever hired you." He held their gaze, calm and direct, no anger in it because there was genuinely no anger, just clarity. "When this is over, the investigation, the arrest, all of it, tell whoever sent you that trying this again will not change anything I'm doing. It will only add to the case for why the reckoning was necessary." He conjured bindings around their wrists with a word, held their wands, and sent a Patronus to Kingsley's office. The stag leapt away across the evening street. The Aurors arrived in 4 minutes. Harry gave a statement, handed over the wands, and walked the rest of the way home, arriving 20 minutes late, which was what brought Hermione out of the study with ink on her hands and a look that moved through relieved and arrived at furious without stopping. "You were walking alone," she said. "Yes," he said. "Harry, I can handle it," he said. "I did handle it." Both of them, wandless, in about 30 seconds. He took his coat off and hung it up. More importantly, who hired them? That's the actual problem. Hermione stared at him for a moment with the specific expression of someone who had 17 things to say and was deciding which to start with. She landed on, "Sit down and I'll tell you what I found while you were out getting shot at." The kitchen. Tea that Ron had made because the lesson had apparently been delivered and received. Neville had already come in from wherever he'd been. He spent mornings at Augusta's now, working through the review court member selections with a list he'd built over a week of careful research, and he sat down across from Harry with his arms on the table and his expression of focused quiet. "Brant," Hermione said, setting a document in front of Harry. "Gellert Brant of the ICW Austrian delegation, as Malfoy predicted. He filed a formal challenge to the Emery's lordship with the ICW's legal committee 3 days ago. It's been working through channels quietly, nobody notified us because it's not a public filing, it's internal. I found it because Sharpclaw has a contact on the ICW's administrative staff." Harry looked at the document. "On what grounds?" "He's arguing that the Emery's lordship cannot be legitimately claimed by someone who is also a claimant of 4 other lordships simultaneously," Hermione said. "He's calling it a monopoly of authority argument, that the concentration of power in one person violates the fundamental intent of the compact itself." She paused. "It's not stupid." "No," Harry agreed, reading. "Is it right?" "Technically, no. The compact doesn't restrict multiple lordship claims. It was written before the concept of multiple lordships in one person was really a political issue, so it doesn't address it at all. But absence of restriction isn't the same as explicit permission in international magical law, which means the argument has legs if the right committee hears it." She sat down. "The challenge is scheduled to be heard at the ICW session in Geneva. The same session you're attending. So it's not just a justification hearing," Harry said. "It's also a challenge to the legitimacy of everything I've done." "They want to retroactively invalidate the reckoning," Neville said. "If they can void the lordship claim, the stripping of the 26 becomes unauthorized, and Lucius Malfoy and Dolores Umbridge get their magic back," Ron said, from the counter where he'd been leaning with his tea. His voice was flat. "Before the review. Before any process." The table was quiet for a moment. Harry looked at the document in his hand and then set it down in thought. He thought about Brant, who believed that power was the only real argument, who would outmaneuver legally and then move to force when that failed. He thought about what Malfoy had said, he'll underestimate the emotional dimension. He thought about what winning in Geneva needed to look like, not just legally but actually, not just deflecting Brant's challenge but making the counter-argument in a way that couldn't be walked back. I need to respond to the challenge before the session, he said. Not defensively. Offensively. Hermione looked at him with the expression she wore when she was trying to determine if what he was suggesting was brilliant or reckless. How? The Peverell Lordship carries the right of challenge to any law or ruling on grounds of magical heritage violation, Harry said. The monopoly argument is predicated on my holding multiple lordships being unprecedented. But the Peverell Lordship itself was held independently of Gryffindor for 3 generations before the Potter line consolidated it. That consolidation was recognized by the Wizengamot in 1843. I can argue that the precedent for lordship consolidation is already established in British magical law, and I can do it as a preemptive filing with the ICW's legal committee before the session. Hermione stared at him. Sharpclaw told me about the 1843 ruling, Harry added. During our Wednesday session. I've been thinking about it. You've been sitting on that, Hermione said, for 4 days. I wasn't sure it was relevant until now, Harry said. Is it workable? She had already picked up a quill. Give me the specific ruling reference and I'll have a response filing by tomorrow morning. I'll flush Sharpclaw now, Harry said. He was halfway to the sitting room when Malfoy appeared in the kitchen doorway, which meant he'd come through the floor on his own initiative, which he'd started doing 2 days ago without asking, and which nobody had commented on because commenting on it would have made it a discussion and not commenting on it meant it simply became a thing that happened. Malfoy looked at Harry. There was an attempt, he said. Not a question. How do you know? Harry asked. There was an attempt, Malfoy repeated, his jaw slightly tight. The 2 people my father sent. The kitchen went very still. Harry looked at Malfoy. Malfoy met his eyes with an expression that was stripped of everything except the thing he was currently required to stand in. Your father sent them, Harry said. I found out an hour ago, Malfoy said. He didn't tell me. He never tells me. The last sentence had a quality to it that Harry recognized as something Malfoy had said before in a different context, and the repetition told him something about the architecture of that family. I'm telling you now. You didn't know, Harry said. Not a question, an assessment. I didn't know, Malfoy confirmed. I know, Harry said, and he did know, with the same certainty he'd applied to anything he'd assessed about Malfoy over the past week. Sit down. Malfoy looked at the kitchen chair like it had personally affronted him and then sat down. Ron put a mug of tea in front of him without comment. Malfoy looked at the mug and then at Ron and something passed between them that wasn't warmth but was further from hostility than either of them would have predicted a month ago. Your father just changed the shape of his own review case significantly, Harry said, sitting back down across from Malfoy. An assassination attempt will be documented and it will be considered in the review court's assessment. I know, Malfoy said. I know that. He wrapped his hands around the mug. I need to ask you something. Ask. The review court, Malfoy said. His case. If I present it, and I intend to present it, regardless of what he did, will it be heard fairly? Or is the court going to look at what happened tonight and, the court is bound to the Emery's Compact, Harry said. The compact requires fair process. Not outcome, process. His case will be heard against the full record, which now includes tonight, but it will be heard. He paused. What he did tonight will not help him. But it won't preclude process. Malfoy looked at him for a long moment. That's unexpectedly principled, he said. Yes, well, Harry said. Something flickered across Malfoy's face that was briefly, genuinely, close to a real smile. It lasted about a second and then resolved back into composed neutrality, but Harry saw it and filed it alongside everything else he'd been filing about Draco Malfoy over the course of 10 days. The ICW filing, Hermione said from behind her document, returning to the issue with characteristic determination. Harry, I need the Sharpclaw contact now. And I need Malfoy's document on Brant, the full version, not the summary. It's in the satchel, Harry said. I know where it is, she said. Malfoy, is there anything else about Brant that isn't in the document? Anything you remember that didn't seem significant when you were writing it? Malfoy turned to look at Hermione with the expression he wore when she surprised him with the quality of a question. He has a particular vulnerability to arguments from historical precedent, Malfoy said slowly. He was classically educated, old European magical tradition, very fixed on the canon. If you can argue from precedent rather than from principle, he'll find it harder to dismiss. He thinks principle is negotiable. He thinks history is a verdict. Hermione's quill was already moving. That's exactly the shape of the Peverell argument, she said. Perfect. You're welcome, Malfoy said, to his tea. The next 8 days were the densest Harry could remember since the war, which had been dense in a different way. The war had been dense with fear and urgency and the weight of things that couldn't wait. This was dense with work, the sustained, detailed, exhausting work of building something durable enough to survive contact with people who wanted it to fail. The preemptive ICW filing went in on Thursday morning, Sharpclaw delivering it personally to the ICW's Geneva office via a method Harry decided not to ask too many questions about. The response from Brant's legal team was swift, a counter-filing that took the argument in a slightly different direction, conceding the 1843 precedent and pivoting to a new argument about the scope of the Emery's Reckonings application. Hermione had the counter-filing done by Friday evening, and by Sunday there were 4 layers of legal argument in play, and the ICW's legal committee had reportedly requested clarification from both sides, which Sharpclaw said was a very good sign and which Malfoy said meant they were losing and which Harry thought was somewhere between both. Priya Kapoor at the Magical Standard ran 3 pieces that week, all of them documenting the pre-session maneuvering in terms that were accessible and specific and openly supported the reckoning's legitimacy. The Prophet ran 2 pieces that were cautiously approving, one that was openly critical, and an opinion column from a former Wizengamot member that Harry actually read twice because its objections were intelligent and some of them deserved to be engaged with. He wrote a response. Not to the paper, to the former member directly, a 3-paragraph letter that acknowledged the legitimate concerns in his piece and explained the compact's safeguards. The man wrote back. They had a correspondence that lasted 3 days and ended with the former member agreeing to speak to Hermione about becoming one of the legal expert seats on the review court. His name was Barnabas Cuff, and he was 73 and had been arguing for Wizengamot reform since 1979 and had lost the argument every single time. He wrote back, I had rather given up. Thank you for the inconvenience of hoping again. Harry kept that letter. Neville finalized the review court member list on Sunday and presented it to Harry in the kitchen with the particular manner of someone who had done a thing completely and knew it. 9 names, with 3-line justifications for each. Harry read through it carefully, asked 2 questions, suggested one modification that Neville immediately agreed with and one that Neville argued against and was right to argue against, and then signed off on it. You argued with me, Harry said. It was the wrong suggestion, Neville said, without apology. Good, Harry said. That's what I need from you on the court. Argue when something's wrong. Neville nodded, and something in his posture had the quality of someone who had just been handed responsibility in a way that felt like it fit, rather than like something to grow into. He'd done the growing already. The fit was just being acknowledged. The formal review court members were announced publicly on Monday. Kingsley put it out through official ministry channels, with full documentation of the Merlin Accord and the Charter. The response was what Harry had expected, a spectrum running from genuine relief to performative outrage, with a significant middle ground of people who were cautiously paying attention. 3 of the stripped Wizengamot members filed formal objections. Barnabas Cuff sent a gracious public statement of support. Umbridge said nothing publicly, which Harry found more interesting than anything she might have said. He visited her on Tuesday. Not to gloat. Not to threaten. He went to her ministry-supervised flat in Mayfair. She hadn't been arrested because the reckoning had suspended her magic and the review court would assess her case, and in the interim she remained subject to ministry supervision rather than detention, and he knocked on the door and waited, and she opened it in a pink cardigan and looked at him with an expression that had changed significantly from the one in the Wizengamot chamber. The calculation was still there. But underneath it was something new, something that looked, around the edges, like uncertainty, which Harry suspected Umbridge had not experienced with any frequency in the last several decades. "I'm not here about the case," Harry said. "The court will handle that. I'm here because there are things I want to say to you that aren't about power." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. He came in. Sat in the chair she indicated, which was the smaller of the two, and faced away from the window, which he noted and didn't care about. She sat in the large chair by the window in a shaft of morning light that was, Harry suspected, completely intentional even now, even stripped of her magic. "You tortured children," Harry said. "You tortured me. You deployed dementors against civilians. You ran a blood registry." He said it all plainly, without heat. "I need you to understand that the court will have all of that on record, documented and verified, and that the outcome of your review will be shaped by it." "I am aware of what the court has," she said, her voice precisely level. "But here's the thing," Harry said. "The court isn't me. I won't be the one making the determination about your case. The 9 members will do that, and they'll do it according to the charter, and whatever they decide, it will be what the evidence supports." He looked at her directly. "I want you to understand that I built it that way on purpose. Not because I don't have opinions about what you've done. Because I do, and because those opinions shouldn't be the law." Something moved in her face. He couldn't say what it was exactly. It didn't look like guilt. He wasn't sure guilt was something Umbridge had straightforward access to, but it looked like a person encountering something that didn't fit the category they'd prepared. "Why are you here?" she said. "Because you need to know this isn't personal," Harry said. "And because I needed to look you in the face and tell you that myself, rather than let you invent your own version of my motivations." He stood. "That's all." He walked out and closed the door behind him, and stood on the pavement outside for a moment in the ordinary London air, and let the whole of it, the classroom with the blood quill, the words still faintly traceable on the back of his right hand, the specific quality of that woman's pleasure in causing harm, let it exist without doing anything to it. Not forgiveness. Not vengeance. Just acknowledgement that it had happened and that he was still here and that the process would do what processes were supposed to do. He walked back to Grimmauld Place. The Geneva preparations accelerated through the final days. Hermione had assembled a legal presentation that was the most organized document Harry had ever seen, and he'd seen several hundred of Hermione's documents. It ran to 60 pages of argument supported by 200 pages of appendices, all of it structured around a central thesis that the Emery's reckoning had not concentrated power but relocated it, from unaccountable individuals to a compact-bound institution. Malfoy had read it on Wednesday and said it was either going to win the argument completely or have absolutely no effect, which Hermione said was less helpful than he seemed to think it was and which Harry thought was probably accurate. "Brant will have prepared for the legal argument," Harry said. "He's had 2 weeks. So have we," Hermione said. "Our legal argument is better," Harry said. "I know it's better. But Malfoy said he'll move to political force when the legal argument starts to fail." He looked at the ICW's formal agenda, which had arrived on Monday, 32 items, with the reckoning justification and Brant's challenge listed as items 11 and 12. He'll have the numbers on the procedural vote if he builds his block correctly. He only needs a simple majority to table the session. "Then we need to take the argument out of the committee room," Neville said. He'd been sitting with his feet up on the coffee table, which Harry had started to think of as Neville's thinking posture. "If the vote happens in committee, it's political. If it happens in open session, it's public," Hermione said. "Right," Neville said. "And who's watching matters." Harry looked at Neville. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it for 4 days, Neville said. My Gran has contacts in the ICW's full membership that aren't connected to Brant's bloc. The Eastern European contingent he's relying on has been at odds with the German and Scandinavian delegations for 6 years over an unrelated land registry dispute. If the German delegation can be persuaded to support moving the reckoning justification to open session, it pulls the floor out of the committee vote, Harry said. Augusta can make the call, Neville said. She won't like it. She'll think it's irregular. She'll do it, Harry said. Because she knows it's right. Neville's mouth curved. Yes, he said. She will. They flew to Geneva on Friday morning. Not by portkey, not by apparition, but on the Hogwarts Express to Edinburgh and then a magical transit through a Scottish gateway that Sharpclaw had arranged, which deposited them into the ICW's entry hall in Geneva with a sensation Harry could only describe as sideways, like being folded briefly and then unfolded in a different location. The ICW's building was old in a way that European magical buildings tended to be old, not shabby, not museum-preserved, but saturated with the accumulated magic of several centuries of international governance, the walls carrying that particular density of spellwork that built up in places where significant things had been decided for a long time. Harry felt the Emery's ring respond to it, recognizing something in the building's magical architecture that predated the current institution. Brant was in the entry hall. He was tall, mid-60s, with white hair and a bearing that suggested he'd spent his career being the most important person in a series of increasingly important rooms. He looked at Harry the way Harry had been looked at by powerful men before, the assessing look that was also a kind of calibration, trying to decide which of the available categories to file this person under. Lord Potter Emery's, he said. The title came out precisely, neither dismissive nor deferential. Councillor Brant, Harry said. Brant's eyes moved over Harry's group, Hermione with the legal satchel, Neville, Ron, Malfoy, Sharpclaw, and he settled last on Malfoy, and something passed across his face. Draco, he said, in a tone that was several things at once. Counselor, Malfoy said, with the specific register of a very formal not quite acknowledgement. Brant looked at Malfoy for a moment and then looked back at Harry, and Harry saw the recalculation happen. Malfoy's presence recontextualized the whole scene, and Brant was processing what it meant that Lucius Malfoy's son was standing in Harry Potter's party at the ICW session in Geneva, and Harry could see from the quality of the recalculation that the man was genuinely intelligent, that he was running multiple contingency tracks simultaneously, that he had prepared extensively. He had underestimated one thing, just as Malfoy had predicted. "We'll see you in the session, Counselor," Harry said, and walked past him into the building. Behind him he heard Malfoy say, very quietly, to Brant, in German, something Harry's German wasn't good enough to catch but that Hermione translated under her breath as they walked, "You should have told him I was coming. He might have prepared differently." The session was tomorrow. Tonight there were formal dinners and diplomatic receptions and 3 bilateral meetings that Sharpclaw had arranged, the German delegation, the Scandinavian bloc, a private 30-minute conversation with the ICW's current president that Harry conducted alone in a side room off the main reception hall while the president asked 11 careful questions and Harry answered each of them directly and completely. The president, a broad-shouldered witch named Celeste Moreau who had been running the ICW for 9 years, looked at him at the end of the conversation and said, in French-accented English, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Harry asked. "Someone louder," she said. "Someone more interested in being historic." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You are more interested in being right." "I'm interested in it working," Harry said. "Whether it's historic is someone else's problem." Moreau looked at him for a moment more. "I will be watching the session with interest," she said, which was not a commitment of any kind and was also, Harry thought, something more than neutral. He went back to the reception. Found Hermione in conversation with a delegation from New Zealand. Found Ron eating methodically through the buffet with the focus of someone who had decided that if he was going to be at a diplomatic reception he was going to get something out of it. Found Neville in a corner talking to a young witch from the Scandinavian bloc with an animation that Harry hadn't quite seen in him before, not romantic, though he couldn't rule it out, the animation of someone who had found a conversation that met them at their actual level. Found Malfoy at the edge of the room, alone, watching the crowd with the expression of someone who had grown up in rooms like this and found them newly strange. Harry stood beside him. "How are you?" Harry asked. The same question Ron had asked him after the Wizengamot, genuinely meant. Malfoy glanced at him. He stopped. "I'm not certain how to answer that." "Try." "Uncomfortable," Malfoy said. "In a way that might be necessary." He looked at the room, the delegations, the formal robes, the careful conversations that would determine whether what Harry had done in Britain was contained or contagious. "I've been in rooms like this my whole life and I always knew what I was doing there. What the purpose was. What was expected." He paused. "I don't know what's expected of me here. That's not a feeling I'm accustomed to." "Nobody expects anything from you here," Harry said. "Except me." Malfoy looked at him. "What do you expect?" "What you've been doing," Harry said. "Telling me the truth. Even when it costs you." Malfoy was quiet for a moment. The reception moved around them, the murmur of a dozen languages, the clink of glasses, the specific atmosphere of power being carefully managed. "My father is going to hate what I've done," Malfoy said. "When this is over and he's assessed by the court, whatever the outcome, he'll know that I went to you. He'll know I helped." "Yes," Harry said. "He will." "And you can't." "No," Harry said. "I can't change that. What you did is what you did. The same way what he did is what he did." He looked at Malfoy. "You're not responsible for his choices. Just yours." Malfoy looked at him for a long moment with that unreadable expression that had been slowly, over 10 days, becoming slightly more readable. "Right," he said finally, and turned back to the room. "We should eat something. Tomorrow is going to be long." "Ron's cleared most of the buffet," Harry said. "Naturally," Malfoy said, and something in his tone was, against all available odds, almost fond. Tomorrow would be the session, and the argument, and Brant with his preparation and his political bloc, and the question of whether what had begun in a Wizengamot chamber would be ratified on the world stage or cut off at its foundations. Tonight was Geneva and a reception and 4 people, 5, counting Malfoy, who had built something worth defending and were here to defend it. Harry ate. He slept well. He dreamed about the garden in Grimmauld Place, the golden light of the founding, the way the cloak had felt when he put it back in his pocket and found that the weight of it was different now. Lighter. Not because it had changed, but because what he'd been carrying it for had. He woke at 6, made tea, badly, because he had never actually learned to make tea well and saw no pressing reason to start, and sat in the hotel room's pre-dawn quiet and felt the 4 rings warm against his hands and thought about what Merlin had built and why and whether, after 800 years, it was finally going to do what it had been designed to do. He thought it was. He thought, let's find out. Chapter 6, The Peverell Reckoning. The ICW session hall seated 300, which was not a number Harry had given much thought to until he walked in and found it almost full. The hall was circular, most of the important magical rooms in Europe were circular, he'd noticed, some architectural instinct toward the shape that prevented corners, with tiered seating arranged around a central floor of white stone inlaid with the ICW's founding sigil. 32 national delegations occupied the upper tiers. Observers and press filled the gallery above that. At the center, at the speaking position that everyone called the floor even though it was technically called the consultation point in the session rules, was a single lectern made of dark wood that looked older than the building around it. Harry took all of this in, and then he found Brant's position in the Austrian delegation's tier, and he found Moreau in the president's chair at the head of the hall, and he found the German delegation and the Scandinavian bloc and counted the rough geography of what he was working with. Augusta Longbottom had made the call. The German delegation had agreed. The Scandinavian bloc had followed, which had pulled 2 smaller northern delegations with them. Whether it would be enough to move the justification to open session rather than committee depended on how many other members Brant had locked down, and Harry wouldn't know that number until the procedural vote happened. He sat with Hermione on his left and Neville on his right in the observers' tier, which was where non-member parties sat. Sharpclaw was beside Neville with the legal documentation in its leather case. Ron was at the end of the row. Malfoy had positioned himself 2 rows back, which Harry hadn't arranged and which Malfoy hadn't explained, and which Harry suspected was Malfoy's way of being present without being attached, keeping a distance that gave him options if the thing went badly. Harry could see Brant in the Austrian tier, talking quietly with a man from the Bulgarian delegation. Their heads were close. Whatever they were saying was finished and decided. This was the refinement of something already planned, the last adjustment before a mechanism was triggered. The session opened. Morrow called the room to order with a voice that needed no help from magic to fill the space, the particular voice of a woman who had been calling rooms to order for long enough that rooms responded to her on instinct. Items 1 through 10 were procedural and administrative, and the hall worked through them with the brisk efficiency of an institution that had learned to move quickly through small things so that large ones got the time they needed. Harry sat and watched the room rather than the proceedings, cataloging expressions and body language the way he'd once cataloged a Quidditch pitch, the shifting weight of alliances, the small adjustments that signaled private communication, the moments when eyes moved across the hall and found other eyes and stayed there a fraction of a second too long. Item 11. The justification hearing for the Emery's reckoning. Morrow read the summary cleanly: date, location, nature of the event, the legal basis invoked, the formal challenge filed by the Austrian delegation. Then she opened the floor. Brant stood before Harry did. He moved to the speaking position with unhurried authority, set a single document on the lectern, 1 page, which Harry read as a confident signal, "Look how little I need to bring this down," and addressed the room. The events of last week in Britain, Brant said, in English for the international benefit with the trace of accent that Harry had noticed the previous evening, represent something this body must take seriously. Not because of what they claim to be, a restoration of ancient authority, a justified reckoning with corruption, but because of what they actually are. He paused, giving the pause the weight of a practiced speaker. They are the action of one 17-year-old individual who walked into a governmental chamber and stripped 26 elected representatives of their fundamental magical nature. Whatever the legal architecture constructed around this act, whatever claims are made about ancient compacts and hereditary authority, the question this body must ask is simple. Is this the kind of precedent the international magical community wants to establish? That power, sufficient power, wielded with sufficient confidence, can simply override the structures of governance that protect us all? It was a good argument. Harry had known it would be. He listened to it the way he'd learned to listen to things that were dangerous, fully, without the defensive reflex of looking for the weakness while it was still being said, because you miss things that way. Brant laid out the challenge methodically, the monopoly of authority argument, the question of unilateral action, the absence of democratic mandate, the risk of precedent. He was thorough and precise, and he spoke for 12 minutes, which was exactly the right length for an opening position, long enough to establish the architecture, short enough to leave room for the drama of detail later. He stepped back from the lectern. Harry stood. He walked to the speaking position, and the hall was the specific quiet of 300 people who had decided to pay attention, and he put his hands on the sides of the lectern, no documents, nothing written, just the rings against the wood, and looked at the room. Councillor Brant is right that this body needs to take what happened in Britain seriously, Harry said. I agree with him completely. That's why I'm here. He let that sit for a second. The question he posed is whether one person with sufficient power can override governmental structures. And his framing assumes that's what the reckoning was, an act of individual power. So let me address that first, directly, before we get into the legal argument. He looked toward the Austrian tier. The Emery's reckoning is not my power. It is the Merlin Compact's authority, operating through me as its current instrument. The distinction is not semantic. The compact was designed by Merlin specifically to function as an authority independent of any individual will. It assessed the record of each Wizengamot member according to documented evidence. It did not ask me what I wanted the outcome to be. I could not have altered the result if I'd tried. He paused. I want you to think about what that means. It means the reckoning is not arbitrary. It is more constrained than a democratic vote, because democratic votes can be wrong, can be manipulated, can reflect the politics of the moment rather than the facts of the record. The compact cannot be manipulated. It has no politics. It reads the evidence and it applies its founding principle: does this body serve the people it governs, or does it serve itself? He looked around the room, taking his time, making the survey unhurried. The Wizengamot of Britain failed that question catastrophically, over decades, on a documented record. That record includes a man imprisoned for 12 years without trial. Children tortured for rule infractions by a ministry-appointed official while the body responsible for oversight looked elsewhere. A governing institution that knew a dark wizard was resurging and chose political convenience over the lives of its own citizens. He looked at Brant directly. The precedent I'm establishing is not that power overrides governance. It's that governance cannot indefinitely override its own founding obligation without consequence. That's not a new principle. That's the oldest one. 3 hours. That was how long the session went before the procedural question of committee versus open session was called to a vote, and in those 3 hours the legal argument was made and challenged and made again in 7 different registers. Hermione presented from the observer's tier on the specific question of the 1843 Peverell precedent and the compact's historical invocations, and she presented it with the focused, precise fluency of someone who had been building toward exactly this argument for 11 days and knew every joint of it and every counter-argument and the answer to every counter-argument. The Bulgarian delegate challenged her on the jurisdiction question. She demolished it. The French Interior Faction's representative challenged the Gringotts certification's international standing. Sharpclaw addressed that from beside Neville in 3 sentences that left no room for follow-up. Brant held his position. He was good at it, absorbing challenges, redirecting, finding the new angle when the last one was closed off. He had the patience of someone who had learned that long arguments, properly managed, tended to exhaust the opposition into concession. He had not accounted for Hermione Granger, who did not get exhausted by long arguments. She got sharper. But the numbers in the room were still uncertain, and Harry could feel the session approaching the fulcrum point, the moment when argument would tip into vote and the political reality would become either the foundation or the ceiling. Then Neville did something Harry had not expected. He stood up. Not to present legal argument, he wasn't positioned for that. He stood in the observer's tier, which technically had no speaking rights in the formal session, and he said, in a voice that carried the particular quality of someone who had decided the protocol question was less important than the actual question, "My name is Neville Longbottom. My parents are Frank and Alice Longbottom. They've been in St. Mungo's Hospital for the past 16 years, in permanent psychological damage, because they were tortured by Death Eaters who were never properly prosecuted. 3 of the 26 people whose magic was suspended by the reckoning sat on the Wizengamot panel that closed the investigation into their case." He looked at Moreau. "I'm not a delegate. I don't have speaking rights. I'm asking for the indulgence of this body for 60 seconds. Moreau looked at him for a moment. Then she said, 60 seconds, Mr. Longbottom." Brant made a movement that was not quite standing but was the beginning of an objection, and then seemed to decide against it. "I'm not here to argue about Emery's compact jurisdiction," Neville said. "I'm here because I want this room to understand what it looks like, on the ground, in a real person's life, when the answer to Councillor Brant's question, is this the kind of precedent we want? Is no. When the answer is that we'd rather protect the structure than the people inside it." He paused. "My parents can't tell you what happened to them. They haven't been able to since I was a year old. I can." He looked around the room, and he didn't look nervous, he looked like someone who had been waiting a long time for the right room. "The system Councillor Brant is asking you to protect against this kind of challenge is the same system that decided their case wasn't worth pursuing. I just want you to hold that fact in your head when you vote. He sat down. The hall was very quiet. Brant stood and said, with the careful tone of a man managing the fact that he'd just been outmaneuvered in a dimension he hadn't prepared for, while Mr. Longbottom's personal experience is, I think, Moreau said, in a voice that closed the subject with the precision of a door being shut, we'll proceed to the procedural vote. The vote was 41 to 29 in favor of open session. Harry let the breath out slowly. Beside him, Hermione made a small sound. Neville was looking at the floor. That was yours, Harry said to him quietly. That vote was yours. I just told the truth, Neville said. Yes, Harry said. That's why it was yours. The open session changed the dynamic entirely, because open session meant the gallery was part of the audience, and the gallery was full of press, and press represented the magical public who would read what had been decided and form opinions that would then flow back into the political reality of every delegation's home government. Brant knew this. Harry watched him recalibrate in real time, watched the strategy shift from winning the vote to managing the record. If he couldn't kill the reckoning's legitimacy, he could at least complicate the narrative around it. He moved to the Hallows. Harry had expected this. Malfoy had not explicitly predicted it, but it was the logical move once the Compact's authority had been sufficiently established, shift the attack to something that couldn't be documented or certified, something that lived in the murky territory between history and myth. The Emery's lordship, Brant said, from the floor, requires mastery of the 3 Peverell artifacts. The Deathly Hallows, as they're known popularly. I want to ask Lord Potteremrys to clarify, for this body, the specific nature of his claimed mastery. Because the international magical community is being asked to accept that a 17-year-old is the master of death, a figure out of legend, and to treat that claim as a legal fact with binding authority. He looked at Harry across the hall. Can you demonstrate this mastery? Can you provide evidence this body can verify? Harry stood. He walked back to the floor. He stood at the lectern and looked at Brant. The Elder Wand, Harry said, is in Albus Dumbledore's tomb in Scotland. I returned it there after the Battle of Hogwarts because the Elder Wand is genuinely dangerous in active use, and I made a decision about what responsible stewardship of it looked like. The Resurrection Stone is buried in the Forbidden Forest at Hogwarts, for reasons that anyone who understands what the stone does will understand immediately. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the invisibility cloak, and held it up, and the hall saw it, saw the impossible quality of it, the way it moved and didn't move like ordinary fabric, the way the light passed through it and came out somehow different. The cloak is here. And the wand, wherever it lies, knows who its master is. You can go to Dumbledore's tomb and attempt to take it, Counselor Brant, and you are welcome to report back to this body what happens when you try. A sound moved through the hall. Not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur. Something between the two. Harry put the cloak away. But here's the thing about the Hallows argument, he said. It's not actually about the Hallows. It's about whether you believe the Gringotts certification or you don't. And if you don't believe Gringotts certification of hereditary magical title, then you don't believe it for any claim, not just mine. That's a challenge to the foundation of international magical inheritance law that goes considerably further than anything I've done. He looked around the hall. Is that the argument this body wants to make? He stepped back. Brant was quiet for a moment. Then he did something Harry hadn't expected. He nodded, very slightly, the nod of a man acknowledging that a point has been made. Not conceding the whole field, but marking the territory. The Peverell argument, Brant said, moving. We'll set the Hallows question aside. Let me ask instead about the scope of the stripping. 26 individuals. Permanent removal of magic for some, temporary suspension for others. The Compact grants this authority, you've argued. I accept, for the sake of this discussion, that it does. What I challenge is the calibration. On what basis were the permanent sanctions decided? It was the most intelligent question he'd asked. Harry had been waiting for it. The Compact's framework assessed each individual's record independently, Harry said. The permanent sanctions applied to members whose records included direct magical harm to other persons, not negligence, not political cowardice, direct harm. That's a specific threshold the compact defines in its own language. I didn't set it. I couldn't override it. He paused. I'll tell you who's on the permanent list if you want. I'll tell you exactly what they did. We can go through it name by name in this session if that's what this body needs to be satisfied that the threshold was correctly applied. It was a gamble. Naming the names in this room meant making the record international, meant everything those people had done being documented in ICW session records that would be read by governments across the world. Brant looked at him. In his eyes Harry could see the calculation, the political cost of forcing that documentation into the record against the political cost of declining. Both were costs. One was larger. That won't be necessary, Brant said. Then we're done with the scope question? Harry asked. A pause. For now, Brant said. The session broke for lunch at 1. Harry ate a sandwich standing up in a corridor with Hermione and Ron while Neville went to make a call to Augusta on an enchanted mirror and Sharpclaw disappeared somewhere doing goblin things that Harry decided not to inquire into. Ron handed Harry a second sandwich without being asked. How are we doing? He said. We're winning, Hermione said. Not decisively yet. But we're winning. Brant knows it, Harry said. He's going to move to the political force stage in the afternoon session. Malfoy said, Where is Malfoy? Ron said. Harry looked around. Malfoy had been in his 2 rows back position through the morning session and Harry hadn't noticed when he'd gone. He checked the corridor, the doors at each end, the visible corners. No grey robes. He'll be back, Harry said, with more certainty than he could entirely justify. He was right. Malfoy reappeared 10 minutes into the afternoon session, sliding back into his row with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done something and completed it and didn't intend to explain unless asked. Harry glanced back at him. Malfoy met his eyes briefly and gave a small, precise nod. Something had happened. Harry filed it. The afternoon began with Brant making a procedural motion to convene a special review committee with the authority to examine the Emery's lordship claim before any binding determination was made. It was the political force move, and it was well constructed. A review committee sounded reasonable, sounded like due diligence, sounded like the kind of institutional caution that was its own form of virtue. The effect, if it passed, would be to suspend any recognition of the reckoning's legitimacy pending a committee process that could run for months. Brant needed a simple majority. He called for a show of hands. 24 hands went up. Harry counted them. 24 out of 73 voting delegates. He needed 37 to fail. He'd needed to peel enough of Brant's block away before the vote and he'd known Augusta was working the room during the lunch break and he'd known Neville was working the Scandinavian connection and he'd hoped it was enough. 24. Brant counted as well. His expression stayed controlled, but Harry saw the tightening. The man had expected more. Something had changed between the morning and the afternoon, some vote he'd counted on had moved. Malfoy's nod. Harry stored that for later. The motion fails, Moreau said. We proceed to the binding determination. What followed was an hour of the most formal magical procedure Harry had ever witnessed. The ICW's legal officers presented their assessment of the documentation. The compact's authority was reviewed against international magical law precedent in 3 separate frameworks, with responses from both the Austrian delegation's legal team and from Sharpclaw, who delivered his portion with the unhurried precision of someone who had been practicing succession law since before most of the humans in the room were born and found the exercise moderately interesting. At the end of it, Moreau asked for the floor. She spoke for 7 minutes. She covered the legal determination first, which was clear, the Gringotts certification held, the compact authority was valid, the reckoning was legally sound. Then she did something Harry had not anticipated. She spoke about the policy question. This body was asked today, Moreau said, whether the precedent established by the British reckoning is one we want to enshrine in international magical law. Councillor Brandt framed this as a question about protecting governance from power. I want to offer a different frame. She looked around the hall. The magical compact that Merlin established was not designed to be used. It was designed to exist. Its presence in our legal tradition is meant to function as a, what do you call it, in English, a ceiling. A limit. The knowledge that there is a mechanism, and that the mechanism works, is itself the deterrent against the behavior that triggers it. She paused. For 843 years, no governing body in the magical world has been subjected to a reckoning. Not because the compact was invoked and failed. Because it existed. She looked at Harry for a moment, and the look was not warm exactly, but it was something. Today we have seen the compact function as its creator intended. A body failed its people. The mechanism activated. The structure continues, reformed. The people, the actual people, the ones Mr. Longbottom spoke about, are being considered. She turned back to the hall. I find this to be exactly what the compact was designed to do. The ICW's formal position is recognition of the reckoning's full legitimacy. Brandt did not move. Harry sat in the observer's tier and felt the emery's ring pulse once, deep, the way it had in the Wizengamot chamber before everything changed, and this time he knew what the pulse meant. The compact, recognizing that its purpose had been acknowledged. Not by one governing body but by the assembled representative of the international magical community. 843 years. The session formally closed 30 minutes later, after the votes of recognition were recorded and the procedural record sealed. Delegations moved and mixed in the way of a formal session ending, the particular social reorganization of people shifting from official position to personal one. Some came toward Harry. The German delegation's lead, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a brisk manner, shook his hand and said that the German community had been waiting for this moment regarding their own internal reform and she wanted to be in contact. The New Zealand delegation offered something similar. 2 other delegations approached about the review court's model, wanting documentation. Brandt left without approaching Harry, which was itself a statement. He walked out with his remaining allied delegates and his single document and the composed expression of a man who would regroup and continue to exist and would find other angles, because that was what men like him did, and Harry watched him go and thought, fine. That's how it should work. Losing an argument shouldn't end you. It should just, lose. He found Malfoy in the corridor after the hall had cleared. The Bulgarian delegate, Harry said. Traded away from Brandt's position this morning, Malfoy said. I had a conversation with him during the lunch break. How? I know him, Malfoy said. He was at school with my father. I've known him since I was a child. He looked at the corridor wall, the old stone. I told him what my father was doing. Not as testimony, not as evidence, as information, person to person. I told him that what he was supporting in that chamber was the same corruption that had produced the reckoning in the first place, just wearing different robes. He paused. He's not a bad man. He's a man who needed someone he trusted to tell him the truth about which side he was actually on. Harry looked at him. You gave up your father's relationship with him. My father gave that up when he sent 2 people to kill you, Malfoy said, with the flat precision of a decision already made and set down. Draco, Harry said. Using the name intentionally, deliberately, for the first time. Malfoy looked at him with slightly wide eyes, the shift almost imperceptible. Thank you, Harry said. Malfoy looked away at the wall again. The composure was there but it was thinner than usual, worn down by the day. Don't make it significant, he said. Too late, Harry said. From down the corridor, Ron's voice, are we eating? I want to eat. Someone who isn't Harry should choose where. Literally anywhere, Hermione said. Any restaurant in Geneva is better than, my tea is fine, Harry said, already walking toward them. Your tea is a cry for help, Ron said. Malfoy made the sound, not quite a laugh, not quite not, and walked with them. They ate at a restaurant near the lake where the menu was in French and the food was extraordinary, and none of them talked about the session for the first 20 minutes, which was the appropriate decompression interval after a significant thing. They talked about the food, and the city, and Neville told a story about Augusta that made Hermione laugh so hard she knocked her wine glass and caught it without spilling a drop, which led to Ron doing a ranking of Hermione's reflexes from best to worst that became a ranking of everyone's reflexes from best to worst that eventually became Malfoy and Ron arguing with genuine heat about the correct definition of reflex versus reaction time, which was not a conversation Harry had predicted existing between those two people but which seemed to be working for both of them. Harry sat at the end of the table and felt the lake out through the restaurant's windows, dark and still under the evening sky, and felt Geneva around him, the old city, the magical community that had made its decisions today, the compact vibrating faintly in its ring against his finger, and felt the distance from the terrible winter of a tent and 3 people and the weight of everything that had needed doing. This was also the weight of things that needed doing. But it was a different weight. The weight of building was different from the weight of surviving. It had volume to it, dimension. You could stand inside it. Harry, Neville said, from beside him, quietly enough that it didn't cross to the others. Harry looked at him. My parents, Neville said. The reopened investigation you promised, into their case. Kingsley's already assigned it, Harry said. The Aura review starts next week. Neville nodded slowly. He looked at the table for a moment. I don't expect, he stopped. Restarted. I know they probably won't recover. I know the damage is permanent. I don't have some hope that the investigation will fix anything that's broken. He looked at Harry. But it matters that someone looks. That the record shows someone looked. It matters, Harry said. Yeah, Neville said. Okay. He reached for his wine glass. Okay. Down the table, Malfoy had apparently conceded something to Ron about reaction time and was doing it with the particular expression of someone who had conceded a point and found the concession less painful than anticipated. Ron was grinning. Hermione was reading the dessert menu with the focus she gave to things that deserved it. Harry picked up his glass. Outside, Geneva and its lake lay quiet under a clear July sky, and the Peverell ring sat cool against his left hand, and somewhere in Scotland the Elder Wand lay in its tomb knowing its master and not needing to be held to know it, and somewhere in a forest a stone lay in the earth, and in Harry's jacket pocket the cloak folded against itself with the patience of something that had always had centuries to spare. The Hallows, and the Lordships, and the court now established, and the international recognition, and 12 days of the hardest work he'd done that wasn't trying not to die. He drank his wine and thought, one more thing. The Wizengamot, the rebuilt one, the real one. One more thing and then the shape of it would be complete. Not done. It would never be completely done. But complete, in the way a sentence is complete when it has said the thing it was trying to say. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 7, The Slytherin Gambit. They came back from Geneva on a Sunday and by Monday morning the delegation started arriving in London. Harry found out about the first one from Kingsley, who sent a Patronus at 7:30 while Harry was making the tea that everyone objected to, the silver links materializing in the kitchen with Kingsley's measured voice coming out of it, French magical attaché requesting urgent meeting. Also German. Also Australian, though I'm not sure how they heard about Geneva so quickly. Also, and I say this with all the composure I have remaining, there is a delegation from the American Magical Congress waiting in my reception area who arrived at 6 this morning and have been there for 90 minutes. Harry drank his tea. Then he sent the stag back with, tell them all Wednesday. I need Tuesday. Tuesday was for something else. He'd been thinking about it since Geneva, since Moreau's speech and the recognition vote and the particular quality of the evening at the restaurant, the way the shape of things had clarified over dinner into something he could see whole. The Wizengamot rebuilding was the last structural piece. But before the structure, there was a conversation he needed to have that had been waiting since the morning after the reckoning, accumulating weight with every day he deferred it. He went to St. Mungo's. Visiting hours started at 9. He arrived at 8:50 and sat in the waiting area of the Janus Thicky ward with a paper cup of hospital tea, much worse than his, which he privately noted, and waited for the healer on duty to clear him. The ward was quiet at this hour, still in the particular morning stillness of institutional places that have their own rhythms independent of the world outside. The healer was a young woman named Rosemary, who had the slightly braced expression of someone who had been briefed that Harry Potter was coming and was managing the fact of it with professional determination. She walked him to the room with the efficient pace of someone showing him something important and wanting the showing to be dignified. Frank and Alice Longbottom had a room together, which Harry hadn't known. It was a decent room, not institutional bleak. Someone had done things to it over the years. There were plants on the windowsill and drawings on the wall that Harry recognized after a moment as Neville's, the same broad simple style as the ones in his grandmother's house in Derbyshire. Alice's wrapper collection sat on the bedside table in a little stack, the sweet wrappers she gave Neville on visits, ordered neatly by someone who understood they mattered even without knowing entirely why. Frank was asleep. Alice was awake, sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the grey London morning with an expression that was present but not focused, like someone watching something that wasn't the view. She had Neville's forehead, Neville's same quality of stillness, and her hands were folded in her lap with a composure that might have been the composure of injury or might have been something deeper than that, something that had found its way through the wreckage to a kind of peace. Harry sat in the second chair. He didn't perform arriving or introduce himself or say anything that required a response. He sat, and Alice glanced at him with the mild, undirected attention she gave to things, and looked back at the window. He stayed for 40 minutes. He didn't talk much. He said once, quietly, that Neville was exceptional, in case she could hear it in any useful way, in case it reached wherever the real part of her was. He said that the people responsible were being looked at properly this time, that it was being taken seriously. He said he was sorry it had taken this long. She didn't respond. He hadn't expected her to. He stayed the 40 minutes because some things needed the time they needed and there was no shortcut that meant anything. When he left he nodded to Healer Rosemary and walked out into the morning and stood on the pavement for a moment and thought about what justice looked like when it arrived too late to fix the actual damage. It looked like this, he thought. It looked like arriving anyway. It looked like the record showing that someone came. He went home and worked. The delegations on Wednesday were managed with Hermione's infrastructure and Kingsley's diplomatic experience and Harry's willingness to be direct in a way that repeatedly surprised the international visitors, who had clearly prepared for something more hedged. The French attaché arrived at 10 with 3 advisors and a prepared position document and spent the first 20 minutes delivering a formal statement that Harry listened to politely and then responded to by setting aside the diplomatic register entirely and asking what France actually wanted. The attaché blinked. Then she set aside her position document and told him, which was that the French magical government wanted observer status on the review court and a formal information sharing agreement about the compact's mechanisms. Done, Harry said. Both of them. Hermione has the paperwork. Hermione produced the paperwork. The German delegation was similar but faster. They'd apparently decided in advance to skip the formal position presentation, having observed the French meeting somehow, and arrived with 2 people and a list of 4 specific requests that Harry worked through in 40 minutes. The Americans were the most interesting. The American Magical Congress sent a delegation of 5, led by a woman named Director Adira Vasquez, who was 40-something and had the specific quality of someone who had risen very high in an institution by being the smartest person in every room she'd ever entered and who had then realized this was a double-edged condition. She shook Harry's hand with a directness that matched his, looked at him with sharp dark eyes, and said, before sitting down, "I want you to know that what you did in that Wizengamot chamber is the most significant single magical act by an individual in my professional lifetime, and I have been doing this for 22 years. Thank you," Harry said. "I'm not complimenting you," she said, sitting. "I'm calibrating. There's a difference." She set her briefcase on the table. "The Makusa has its own version of what happened in your Wizengamot. Different structure, different history, same fundamental rot. I want to know if the Emery's Compact has American applicability. The room was quiet for a moment. I don't know, Harry said. Genuinely, the compact was established in Britain by a British wizard operating within a British magical tradition. Whether its authority extends internationally is a legal question I haven't answered yet. He looked at her. But the model is absolutely applicable anywhere. The principles. The structure of the review court. The idea that a governing body has to be answerable to something other than itself. He paused. That's not proprietary. That's just true. Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. You'd share the charter documentation. We'd share everything, Hermione said from Harry's left. The charter, the compact analysis, the legal framework Gringotts helped us build. All of it. If you can use any of it, use it. Vasquez looked at Hermione. You wrote the charter. Most of it, Hermione said. I'd like your contact information as well, Vasquez said. Hermione produced a card. Vasquez took it with the expression of someone making a connection they intended to use significantly. After the delegations, after Kingsley's debrief, after an hour with Sharpclaw going through the review court's administrative setup, Harry went home and found Malfoy in the kitchen. This was not unusual anymore. Malfoy had been appearing at Grimmauld Place with the frequency of someone who had nowhere better to be and hadn't yet worked out what to do about that fact. He was usually either in the kitchen or in the study, and he was usually doing something productive, reading through documents, identifying problems in drafts, occasionally cooking, which turned out to be something he did with the same precise competence he brought to everything, which Ron had responded to by staging what he called a neutral exchange of culinary skills that mostly involved Malfoy teaching Ron how to make a proper beurre blanc and Ron teaching Malfoy how to make Molly Weasley's beef stew from memory. Today Malfoy was at the kitchen table with a letter in front of him and the expression of someone who had been staring at it for long enough that it had stopped meaning anything. My father wants to see me, Malfoy said, without preamble. He sent 3 letters this week. This is the one where he stopped being indirect about it. Harry sat down. What does he want? To tell me to stop, Malfoy said. What I've been doing. He doesn't know the specifics, I haven't told him specifics, but he's worked out the general shape of it. That I've been here. That I've been, he paused. Useful. Are you going to see him? Malfoy was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. He's my father. That doesn't stop meaning something just because, he made a gesture at the letter that encompassed everything the letter represented. He sent people to kill you. He did, Harry said. And I'm sitting in your kitchen, Malfoy said. You are, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him with an expression that was not quite asking for something and was not quite not asking. Does that make me, he stopped. Tried again. I've been thinking about what I am now. What category? I'm not, I spent my whole life knowing exactly what I was and what that meant and what was expected. He looked at his hands. I don't know what this is. Harry thought about what Luna had said to him in Devon. You're allowed to want things for yourself. You're someone who made a different choice, Harry said. That's all it needs to be right now. That's not very, Malfoy searched for the word. Definitive. No, Harry agreed. But definitive comes later. Right now you just made the choice. Give it time to become something. Malfoy looked at him for a moment, and the expression on his face was one Harry hadn't seen on it before, open, briefly, in a way that cost something and acknowledged the cost. Then he folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket and said, the Wizengamot reconvening. When? Friday, Harry said. First session of the rebuilt chamber. Who's chairing? Augusta Longbottom, Harry said. Interim, until the new chief warlock is properly elected. She didn't want to. I asked her anyway. Malfoy considered this. She's the right choice. She usually is, Harry said. She just makes it difficult for you to notice. My father needs his case presented to the review court before Friday, Malfoy said. Before the new Wizengamot sits. It matters to him, the timing, the optics. Even now, he stopped. Even without magic he's thinking about optics. His case can be presented when the court is ready to hear it, Harry said. The court determines the schedule, not me. I know, Malfoy said. I know that. He pressed his thumb to the edge of the table, a small precise gesture. I want there to be something left of him on the other side of this that isn't just, he didn't finish. Present his case, Harry said. Do it well. That's what you can do. Malfoy nodded, very slightly. Then he said, I'll cook tonight. You look like you haven't eaten properly in 2 days. I had a sandwich, Harry said. That's not what I said, Malfoy said, and stood and went to examine the contents of the larder with the focused energy of someone who had decided that this was the problem he could actually solve today. Harry let him. Thursday was the last preparation day before the reconvened Wizengamot, and it surfaced the thing Harry had been half expecting since Geneva, the thing that had been building in the background of every meeting and every document and every conversation, the question that polite people had been not asking because they were polite and impolite people had been not asking because they were calculating, and that Harry himself had been keeping in the background because there had always been something more immediate. The question arrived, formally, in a letter from the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement, countersigned by Kingsley. In the matter of the reconvened Wizengamot, the question of Lord Potteremery's formal role within the new structure requires resolution prior to the first session. Specifically, for Lordship seats represent an unprecedented concentration of voting power within a single member. The department requests Lord Potteremery's position on how this concentration should be managed going forward. Harry read it over breakfast. Ron read it over his shoulder and said, They're asking how powerful you're going to let yourself be. Yes, Harry said. What's the answer? Hermione asked from across the table. She'd known this question was coming, had known since the outline of the review court, had built the charter with it in mind, and Harry could see from her expression that she had thoughts about the answer that she was waiting to offer. Tell me, Harry said. She set her mug down. The 4 seats carry specific authorities. Gryffindor, emergency session convening. Peverell, legal heritage challenge. Slytherin, Parseltongue registry and creature law. Emery's, veto and reckoning. She looked at him. Those are 4 distinct oversight functions, not 4 votes on ordinary legislation. If you exercise them as oversight, use each seat for its specific purpose rather than as general voting power, you're not concentrating power in a way that distorts the chamber. You're acting as an oversight mechanism, which is what the compact designed you to be. I recuse myself from general votes, Harry said. From all general votes, Hermione said. Use the specific authorities of each seat only when they're directly relevant. Make it a formal position, Lord Potteremery's holds oversight seats, not governing seats. It's the distinction between being in the room and running the room, Neville said. Exactly, Hermione said. And it preempts the argument that you've created a monarchy. Harry looked at them. The argument that one person shouldn't hold this much power, the one that his own mind had been running quietly in the background since Ragnarok had laid out the Lordships, this was the answer to it. Not giving the power up. Using it correctly. The power wasn't the problem. What you did with it was the problem. Had always been the problem. Draft it as a formal declaration, Harry said. I'll present it at the opening of Friday's session. Before anything else. Hermione already had the quill. Thursday evening, Harry went to Diagon Alley alone. Not for any specific purpose, the prepared speech was done, the review court was operational, the international recognition was secured, the Malfoy situation was managed, the delegations were handled. He went because he wanted to walk through the place that had been the first magical world he'd ever seen, the place he'd walked into at 11 with Hagrid and felt the ground shift under him permanently, and he wanted to feel it now, this version of himself, in this version of the world. It was a warm evening. The alley was doing its ordinary evening business. Florian Fortescue's had reopened under a cousin of the original owner, and the queue was long. Quality Quidditch supplies had a new broom in the window that Harry looked at for a moment with the straightforward pleasure of someone who loved flying and didn't always let himself just appreciate a well-made broom. Ollivander's, rebuilt, had a light in the window, and through the glass he could see the old man at his workbench, which made something settle in Harry's chest. He stopped at the apothecary and bought a small something for Neville because Neville had mentioned last week that he was thinking about herbology research and hadn't had time to get supplies. He stopped at Madame Malkin's because 3 people had separately suggested he should have something more formal than his existing robes for the Friday session, and one of them had been Malfoy, which he'd taken as the most credible opinion on the matter. He stood in the fitting room while Madame Malkin's assistant did things to fabric around him and thought about what tomorrow was. The rebuilt Wizengamot. 57 remaining members plus the new seats to be established for the review court's recommendations. Augusta Longbottom in the chair. Harry in 4 seats that he was going to exercise as oversight, not governance. And the thing he was going to say before all of that. He'd been working on it in the back of his mind for the week since Geneva, not consciously drafting it but letting it accumulate, the thing he wanted the new Wizengamot to begin with, the statement that should precede everything else, that should be the first thing in the record of this new version of the institution. It wasn't a speech. He'd never been good at speeches and had stopped trying. It was simpler than a speech. It was just the truth, said plainly, in the right room at the right time. He went home and slept and woke at 5 and lay in the early morning dark and went through the 4 rings in sequence: Gryffindor warm, Peverell cool, Slytherin neutral, Emery's absent, in the way that the most significant things were sometimes absent, like they'd become so integrated that you could only feel them by attending to them deliberately. He attended to them deliberately. He felt each one. Then he got up and made the terrible tea and sat with it in the kitchen alone, which was where Malfoy found him at 6, arriving through the flue with the look of someone who had also been awake at 5 and had decided that company was better than the alternative. Malfoy made real tea without comment and sat across from Harry, and they sat in the early morning kitchen quiet without speaking for a while, which had become, over the course of 2 weeks, a comfortable thing between them. The particular comfort of 2 people who had said enough to each other that the gaps between words didn't need filling. "I'm presenting my father's case next week," Malfoy said eventually. "I know. He wrote again last night," Malfoy said. "After I went to see him." "He'd gone, then?" Harry hadn't asked. "He wanted to know if I understood what I'd done." He turned his mug slowly. "I told him I understood exactly what I'd done. He said I'd chosen a side." He paused. "I told him I'd chosen a principle. That they weren't the same thing." Harry looked at him. He looked, Malfoy stopped. Old. He looked old. Without the magic he looks like someone's taken something structural out of him. The thing he's been standing on. He looked at the table. "I don't know if that's the punishment or just the reality of who he's been, and I can't tell anymore if I'm pitying him or just seeing him clearly for the first time, and I'm not sure the difference matters practically." "It might matter to you," Harry said. Malfoy looked up. "You're allowed to feel both things," Harry said. "He's your father and he sent people to kill me, and both those things are true at the same time." "That's," Malfoy made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's almost the same thing you said to me the first day. About the compound, about wanting a path that doesn't end in more damage." "Still true," Harry said. Malfoy looked at him for a long moment in the early morning kitchen, the blue light coming through the window above the sink, the tea steaming, Grimmauld Place quiet around them, and said, with the specific precision of someone committing to a thing they'd been working toward for a while without explicitly knowing it, "I'd like to be useful to what you're building. Not to repay something, not because I've calculated the advantage. Because it matters and I want to be part of something that matters." He held Harry's gaze. "If you'll have me." Harry looked at him. The Draco Malfoy who had held out his hand on a Hogwarts train platform at 11 and told Harry Potter that he'd make better friends than certain other people. The Draco Malfoy who had been handed a wand and a task and a terror that was too big for him at 16. The Draco Malfoy who had appeared at this kitchen door with information that cost him something real, every single time, without being asked. "You're already in it," Harry said. "You have been since the first morning." Something happened in Malfoy's face that was brief and unguarded and might, in the right light, be called relief. Then the composure reassembled, looser than before, worn differently. "I'm aware," he said. "I was asking you to say it." "Needing it said isn't a weakness," Harry said. "I know," Malfoy said. "I'm working on that." He looked at the window. "Today's important." "Today's important," Harry agreed. "Wear the new robes," Malfoy said. "Malkins did good work." "I know you told them what to make," Harry said. Malfoy said nothing, which was its own confirmation. The new robes were dark, simple, well cut, with the 4 lordship sigils rendered subtly at the cuffs, not announced, not displayed, just present for those who knew to look. Harry put them on and looked in the mirror and thought, "Yes, that's right," and went downstairs. Ron was in the kitchen. Hermione was in the kitchen. Neville arrived at 8:30. Luna appeared on the doorstep at 8:45, in robes that were technically the wrong color for a Wizengamot session and exactly right for being Luna, with a small gift wrapped in silver paper that she pressed into Harry's hands. "For after," she said. "Open it when the session is done and you're back here tonight and everyone's had something to eat." "What is it?" he asked. "Something I painted," she said. "You'll know what it means when you see it." She looked at him with those clear, precise eyes. "You're going to do something important today. I just wanted you to have something for the end of it." Harry put the gift in his jacket pocket next to the cloak. They walked to the ministry together, all of them, through the London morning, pavement and pigeons and ordinary people going to ordinary jobs, and Harry walked with his hands in his pockets and the 4 rings warm against his fingers and the gift in his pocket and the last piece of the thing he'd started in a Gringotts ritual room arranged in his mind like furniture in a room that was finally ready to be lived in. Beside him, Ron was talking to Neville about the Chudley cannons with the passion of a man who had loved an objectively bad team for so long that the love had become independent of the team's quality, which was its own kind of devotion. Behind him, Hermione and Luna were having a conversation about arithmancy that had apparently branched into something about migrating bird patterns, which was also classic. Malfoy walked beside Harry, slightly behind, saying nothing, which was the right amount of saying nothing. The ministry atrium. The lift. Level 9. Courtroom 1. The chamber was full. All 57 remaining members. The review court's 3 observer seats, occupied. The press gallery, Priya Kapoor at the front, quick quotes quill ready, expression of someone who intended to document this correctly. Augusta Longbottom in the presiding chair, formidable hat at combat angle, looking like she'd been born for this specific role and was mildly irritated that it had taken this long to arrive. Harry walked to the center of the floor. He looked up at the chamber. The chamber looked back. He thought about the Slytherin ring, neutral, room temperature, waiting, and what that neutrality meant. Slytherin had been about ambition, about cunning, about using your intelligence in service of your survival. He'd spent years fighting the idea that he had any Slytherin in him, and then more years accepting it, and now he'd arrived at a place where the Slytherin in him was just part of the instrument. The ambition to build something that lasted. The cunning to know what fights to pick. The survival instinct redirected into something that served more than just himself. He thought about the gambit. Not a trick. Not a concealment. The real meaning of the word, a calculated opening move that gives something up in order to gain a position. He was giving up the full power of 4 seats in exchange for the position of someone the new Wizengamot could trust. That was the Slytherin gambit. And it was going to work. "Before this session begins," Harry said, and the chamber went quiet with the immediacy of a room that had been waiting, "I want to present a formal declaration regarding the exercise of my lordship seats. For the record." He presented it. Clearly, concisely, without ceremony. The 4 seats as oversight rather than governance. The recusal from general legislation. The specific use of each seat's particular authority only when directly applicable. The formal position of Lord Potteremrys as oversight instrument of the Emrys Compact rather than general member of the governing body. He felt the chamber process it. Felt the shift, not relief exactly, but something like recalibration. The narrative that had been building about one person holding too much power quietly restructuring itself around the reality of what he was actually doing with it. Augusta Longbottom looked at him from the presiding chair. "The declaration is accepted for the record," she said. "Lord Potteremrys. You may take your seats." Harry walked to the members' tier. He sat in the 4 seats that had been arranged in a specific configuration, adjacent, marked with the 4 sigils, facing the chamber floor from the oversight position at the chamber's edge. He sat in them in sequence, one by one, each ring touching the ancient wood and something in the chamber's deep magical architecture recognizing the contact. Then he looked at Augusta Longbottom and nodded. "The new Wizengamot is in session," she said. The hall came alive with the sound of a new thing beginning. Chapter 8, What We Build. 3 weeks after the new Wizengamot sat for the first time, Lucius Malfoy appeared before the review court. Harry wasn't in the room for it. That had been a deliberate decision. His presence would have weighted the proceedings in a way that conflicted with the court's independence, and the court's independence was the whole point. He knew this. He stayed away without difficulty. He was in the Grimmauld Place kitchen when Neville came back. Neville sat down and poured himself tea, properly made, since Hermione had instituted a rotation that explicitly excluded Harry, and was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet that meant he was organizing something before he said it. "He presented it himself," Neville said. "Didn't let Draco speak for him. Stood up in front of the court and made his own case. He turned the mug. I wasn't expecting it to be what it was. He's a smart man. Not redeemed, I want to be clear about that. But genuinely intelligent, and he came in knowing exactly what the record showed and he addressed it head-on instead of around it. He paused. He acknowledged the harm. Not all of it, not with the full weight it deserved, but he acknowledged specific instances. By name. I don't think he's done that before." "What was the determination?" Harry asked. "Temporary suspension extended by 18 months, Neville said. With conditions, mandatory cooperation with the Auror review of the open cases, full financial disclosure to the court for the period in question, and quarterly check-ins." He looked at his tea. He accepted all of it. No objections. Harry absorbed this. Draco wasn't in the room. "He was in the gallery," Neville said. "He watched the whole thing. When his father accepted the conditions, Draco, he didn't do anything visible. But he sat differently afterward. You'd have to know him to notice." Harry would have noticed. "He didn't say this." "The court worked," Neville said. "That's what I keep coming back to. Someone made a case, evidence was reviewed, a determination was made, conditions were set. The process was the point and the process worked." "Yes," Harry said. "That's what it was supposed to do." Neville looked at him. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not surprised it worked," Harry said. "I built it to work." He said it without arrogance, just plainly, the way you state a fact about something you made with attention and care. "I'm glad it worked." "Those are different things." Neville smiled at that. "A real one, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there." "Fair enough," he said. Malfoy came by that evening. Harry had expected him earlier, had thought he might come directly from the court, but he arrived at 7, which meant he'd spent several hours somewhere else first, doing whatever you did with the afternoon of the day your father stood in a review court and accepted accountability for a portion of what he'd been. He looked composed. He looked tired beneath the composed. He sat in the kitchen and accepted tea without commenting on its quality, which Harry took as a measure of something. "I know what the outcome was," Harry said. "Then you know it's what I hoped for," Malfoy said. He held the mug. He shook my hand afterward. Outside the court. He shook my hand and he said, he stopped. Pressed his lips together briefly. He said I'd done what I thought was right and that I should continue to do that. He looked at the table. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it right now, Harry said. That's the second time you've told me I don't have to do something with a feeling right now, Malfoy said, with a trace of something that was almost amusement. It keeps being true, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him. In the weeks since Geneva, the looking had changed quality, less assessment in it, less distance. More directness. Like a window that had been cleaned. What you said this morning about building something to work, he said. Neville told me. Did he? He told me because he thought I should hear it, Malfoy said. The specific phrasing. That you built it to work. He paused. The court that my father just stood in front of. You built it in 10 days. We built it, Harry said. You were part of the 10 days. Malfoy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the precision of someone making a statement they've thought about carefully, I want to formalize what I've been doing. Not informally useful, formally. A role with the review court, if there's one that makes sense. Or with the Wizengamot oversight function. He met Harry's eyes. I know how these systems work from the inside. I know where the gaps are. I know how people like my father, like the people who were stripped, I know how they think and what they protect and where the vulnerabilities are in any reform that doesn't account for how clever and patient the opposition can be. Harry looked at him. You'd be walking into rooms full of people who hate you for the wrong reasons and distrust you for the right ones. I'm aware, Malfoy said. You'd have to be completely transparent about your process. Every recommendation you make, every assessment, would be scrutinized. I know, Malfoy said. I'm thorough. I can document everything. And you do this because it matters, Harry said. Not because of what it makes you look like. Malfoy held his gaze. I would do this because it matters, he said. Yes. Harry studied him for a moment, not testing, just looking, the way you look at something you want to see accurately. Then he said, come to the Wizengamot session on Thursday. I'll introduce you to Augusta. Malfoy's expression shifted. Something briefly visible before it settled. She'll hate it, he said. She'll resist it loudly for about 15 minutes, Harry said. Then she'll put you to work. The new Wizengamot moved faster than the old one, which wasn't surprising. 57 members with the weight of institutional failure fresh in the room tended to move with the energy of people who had narrowly avoided something and were not inclined to repeat the experience. 3 new pieces of legislation in the first 2 weeks, all of them things that had been stalled in committee for years: expanded Muggle-born student support through Hogwarts, a revised creature rights framework that the old Wizengamot had deferred 11 times, and the formal dissolution of the Blood Status Registry, which Hermione received the news of by Patronus while sitting at the kitchen table and said nothing for a full 30 seconds before pressing both hands flat on the table and breathing out very slowly and deliberately. Harry left her alone with it. Some moments needed the space they needed. He used the Peverell seat twice in the first 3 weeks, both times on heritage challenges to proposed administrative measures that had been drafted with good intentions and insufficient attention to the rights of half-blood families in the northern communities. Both challenges passed. The measures were redrafted properly and returned. He used the Gryffindor seat once, to call an emergency session on a situation in the Scottish magical community that Priya Kapoor's paper had broken first, a district-level dispute that had been escalating towards something that needed central intervention before it became something worse. The emergency session happened in 2 hours. The situation was addressed. Priya sent a brief note afterward: the system working is the most interesting story I've run in 2 years. I'll try not to enjoy it too much. Harry sent back, enjoy it. That's allowed. The Emery's veto stayed unused. Harry thought about that sometimes, the weight of having it, the specific responsibility of a mechanism that could override any decision of any magical governing body in Britain, sitting in a ring on his right hand like a very powerful word you never actually needed to say. He understood now, in a way he hadn't fully in that Gringotts meeting room, why Merlin had built the veto into the compact. It wasn't meant to be used frequently. It was meant to make the people in the chamber govern as though it could be. The ceiling was the point. Kingsley told him, in their second-month check-in, that the new Wizengamot had reached more legislative consensus in 6 weeks than the old one had in the preceding 2 years. The oversight function changes how people vote, Kingsley said. When they know there's a mechanism that can catch genuine malfeasance, the political calculations shift. People who would have traded favors or sat on evidence, they're aware the cost of that is different now. Good, Harry said. It's not perfect, Kingsley said. 3 members are still privately hostile to the reform. 2 others are dragging their feet on the creature rights implementation in their districts. The Brant opposition at the ICW is regrouping. There's a working group forming around an alternative interpretation of the compact that will probably produce a legal challenge within the year. I know, Harry said. All of those. And you're not worried? I'm paying attention, Harry said. That's not the same as worrying. Kingsley looked at him with that quality of assessment he'd had since Harry had first properly met him in the order, the look that took the measure of a person the way a craftsman measures material, not judgment, calibration. You've changed, he said. Since the battle. Since all of this. I know, Harry said. In the good direction, Kingsley said. I want to be clear about that. The Hogwarts letters went out in August, as they always did, and for the first time Harry read about them not as a student and not as someone who had nearly died in the building but as one of the people the school now formally reported to. The Review Court had oversight of educational institutions under the new charter, a provision Neville had insisted on and Harry had immediately agreed with. He read the Hogwarts Governor report with the attention he gave to documents that mattered, and he saw the new defense against the dark arts curriculum, which had been revised under Minerva McGonagall's direction, and the new pastoral care provisions, and the formal abolition of the House Cup as a competitive mechanism in favor of something more genuinely collaborative. He went to Hogwarts in September. Not officially. Not as Lord Potteremry's or as an oversight visit. He went on a Tuesday afternoon because Minerva had written to him personally and said simply, "Come when you're ready. The castle would like to see you." He came through the gates on foot, the way he'd always come in first year, and the grounds were the same, the lake, the forbidden forest, the sky doing the Hogwarts thing where it seemed slightly larger than regular sky, and the castle rose at the end of the grounds with all its towers and its age, and Harry stood at the gate for a moment and felt the sum of every feeling he'd ever had about this place arrive simultaneously, which was an experience he let happen without trying to sort or manage it. Then he walked up. Minerva met him in the entrance hall, which smelled exactly as it always had, stone and old magic and something faintly like autumn leaves no matter the season, and she looked at him the way she'd always looked at him, which was the look of someone who had watched a person grow up and was continuously surprised by the direction of the growth even when they'd hoped for it. "Harry," she said. "Professor," he said, and she did the thing she did when people called her that, which was accept it with a slight precision, neither encouraging nor discouraging. She showed him the changes. The new classroom arrangements, the pastoral rooms, the room of requirement restored and repurposed as a student support space. The great hall where the house tables were sometimes replaced by round ones for the new collaborative projects the curriculum included. She showed him the defense classroom, which had a window now that it hadn't before, someone having correctly determined that a room where you taught defense against darkness should have natural light in it. And she showed him the memorial. It was in the corridor outside the great hall, where the stone was smooth and old and the light came in from the western windows in the late afternoon. A long list of names, carved into the stone properly, not temporary, not provisional, not a notice board but actual memorial architecture, the kind that said this is permanent, this matters, we are not going to look away from this. Every person who had died in the Battle of Hogwarts. Students and staff and members of the Order and people who had come to fight because it was right and had not come home. Fred Weasley. Remus Lupin. Nymphadora Tonks. Colin Creevey. 50 others. Harry stood in front of it for a long time. Minerva stood beside him and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. He looked at Fred's name and thought about George, who was running the joke shop and who had told Harry at a Sunday dinner at the Burrow 3 weeks ago, with the specific delivery of a man who had decided that laughing was the only alternative to drowning, that Fred would have been absolutely insufferable about Harry's lordships and would never have let him hear the end of it. Harry had laughed. It had felt right and wrong at the same time, which was how grief worked, he'd been told, which he now knew to be true. He looked at Lupin's name and thought about the werewolf provisions in the new creature rights framework, which were the most substantial protections in the legislation and which had passed the new Wizengamot without the objections that had killed every previous version. He looked at Colin Creevey's name and didn't have a thought. Just looked at it for a while and let it be the specific kind of terrible that it was. "It's right," he said finally. "The memorial. It's right." "It took too long," Minerva said, which was both an acknowledgement of the fact and an apology for it. "Yes," Harry said. "But it's here now." He had lunch with Minerva and then walked the grounds alone for an hour, which the castle seemed to accommodate. He went where he wanted to go and the paths did the Hogwarts thing of being the right length for the amount of thinking he needed to do. He went to the lake. He sat on the bank where he and Ron and Hermione had sat in the last weeks of 6th year, the sun on the water, everything about to break open in the worst possible direction, none of them knowing it would be as bad as it was about to be or that it would end the way it did. He sat there now and the lake was the same lake and the sky was September blue and he was 18 years old and he had 4 lordships and a rebuilt court and an international recognition from the ICW and the specific question that kept arriving was, what now? He thought about what Dumbledore had wanted for him, a normal life, a quiet one, the famous old wizard's guilty wish that Harry might have what was taken from him. He thought about it without the complicated feelings it used to generate, the tangle of love and frustration and grief. He thought about it simply. He didn't want a quiet life. He'd found that out over the last 2 months with a clarity that surprised him. He wanted this, the work, the building, the specific satisfaction of a system operating the way it was meant to operate. He wanted the oversight and the arguments and the Priya Kapoor correspondence and the Thursday sessions with Augusta Longbottom, who had told him last week with the aggression of a compliment that he was the most irritatingly competent young person she had encountered in 40 years of public service. He wanted to be in the room. Not to run it. Just to be there, with his hand on the mechanism, making sure the mechanism served the people it was supposed to serve. That was what he wanted. He sat with that beside the lake and the lake was peaceful and unhelpful in the way that lakes were, and he thought, all right. That's what this is for. He went back to London. The dinner that evening was at the Burrow, because Molly Weasley had decided, and once Molly Weasley decided a thing it had the quality of geological fact, that the current moment required a proper dinner with everyone present, and everyone present meant everyone, which on this occasion included Hermione and Neville and Luna and Malfoy, whose invitation had apparently been extended by Ron with the particular ease of someone who had stopped being surprised by the directions his life had taken, and was choosing to be deliberately welcoming about them instead. The Burrow was the Burrow. There was no more efficient description, it had its own quality of existing, the impossible stacked construction of it, the chickens and the garden and the smell of something wonderful coming from the kitchen, and Molly Weasley in the middle of it with the focused authority of a woman who expressed love primarily through feeding people and saw no reason to stop. Harry sat at the long table in the garden where they'd eaten in summers past and looked at the people around it. Ron beside Hermione in the way they sat beside each other now, with the comfortable adjacency of a thing that had been decided without being announced, shoulders touching, occasional quiet exchanges that had the particular quality of conversations inside a conversation. Harry had asked Ron about it 3 weeks ago in the straightforward manner he'd promised himself he'd apply to personal things as well as political ones. Ron had gone slightly pink and said, "Yeah, it's, yes." "Good," Harry had said, which was his complete position on the subject. Neville was at the other end of the table talking to George, who was doing impressions of various Wizengamot members that were accurate enough to be genuinely funny and inappropriate enough to be exactly right for the Burrow's back garden. Luna was sitting in the grass rather than at the table, which nobody had questioned because it was Luna, watching something in the hedge that Harry suspected only she could see. Ginny was beside her father, home from the Holyhead Harpies pre-season, her hair long again and her presence the specific vivid quality that was Ginny Weasley, and when she caught Harry's eye she gave him the look she always gave him now, not the complicated look of the history between them, just something warm and direct, the look of someone who was glad you're here and means it cleanly. They'd had the conversation in June, he and Ginny, the real one, the one where they looked at what they'd been and decided what they were going to be. It had been a good conversation. It had been honest in the way that things could only be honest when you'd both survived enough to not be afraid of the truth. She'd said, "I loved you. I think part of me always will. But I need you to not be my whole world. I need to be your equal, not your protected thing," Harry had said. "Yes," she'd said. "And you don't want to protect me, specifically. You want to protect everyone, and I'd rather be part of the everyone than the reason for it." "You are part of the everyone," Harry had said. "Right," she'd said. "So we should probably be friends." "I'd like that," Harry had said. And they were. It was, like most right things, simpler than the complicated feelings that had preceded it. Malfoy was seated next to Arthur Weasley, which was a combination of people that Harry would not have predicted but which appeared to be working. Arthur had apparently asked Malfoy something about Muggle automotive mechanisms, possibly as a conversational olive branch, possibly out of genuine curiosity, and Malfoy was explaining something about internal combustion engines with an accuracy that suggested he'd been reading about Muggle technology and not mentioning it, which was also exactly what Harry would have expected from someone who prepared for everything and showed nothing. Arthur was delighted. His face was doing the specific thing it did when he encountered Muggle information delivered competently. Molly put food on the table in the Molly way, several things simultaneously, carried with the ease of someone who had been feeding a large family for 30 years and had refined the logistics to something approaching art, and the table arranged itself around the food, conversations finding their new channels, and Harry sat in the middle of it and felt it. The specific warmth of a table full of people you'd chosen. He thought about the tent, the three of them, the winter of it. He thought about the forest. He thought about the Gringotts ritual room and the 4 minutes of significant pain and the rings settling onto his fingers with the quality of things that had always belonged there. He thought about the Wizengamot chamber, the rooms lighting up, and 26 people sitting very still in a way that meant something had changed and they knew it. He thought about what Merlin had built, and what he'd built inside it, and what the people around this table had built with him. Ron's voice, from across the table, "Harry. George just said something you need to hear." "What?" Harry said. He said, Ron said, with the restrained glee of someone delivering a good line, that the Ministry gift shop is selling commemorative plates with your face on them and they've outsold every other item in Ministry gift shop history including the Minister for Magic bobbleheads. Harry looked at George, who raised his wine glass with an expression of pure, unambiguous delight. "I want royalties," Harry said. The table erupted. Even Malfoy made the sound. After dinner, when the garden had gone soft in the evening light and the table was scattered with glasses and the comfortable debris of a meal properly concluded, and people had redistributed themselves across the garden in the natural way of long dinners, Luna still in the grass, Neville and George having migrated to the fence, Arthur and Hermione in a conversation that had clearly become serious in an interesting direction, Harry found a moment of stillness and remembered Luna's gift. He took it from his pocket. The silver paper was soft, folded precisely in that particular way Luna folded things, and he opened it there in the garden with the last of the light. It was a painting. Small, the size of a large book, in watercolor, Luna's medium, the washes of color that built presence from absence. The image was the Grimmauld Place garden, the night of the Merlin Accord founding, and she'd captured the golden light, not exactly as it had been, because exact wasn't Luna's mode, but true to what it had felt like, the warmth and the weight of it, the way the light had come from inside the moment rather than outside it. In the garden she'd painted were 5 figures, Harry at the south point, Hermione beside him, Neville at the north, Ron at the west with his arms folded, and Luna herself at the east in her moonstone robes. And in the center, where the light was brightest, where the 4 points came together, nothing. Just the light. Just the thing being built. She'd written on the back in her small, drifting handwriting, "For Harry." Who stood in the center and made room for everyone else. With love from Luna, who saw it from the east. Harry held the painting for a long moment. Neville appeared beside him, coming back from the fence. He looked at the painting. "That's, oh," he said. The specific "oh" of someone seeing something they didn't have a more precise word for. "Yes," Harry said. "She painted it before it happened," Neville said. "Didn't she?" "Probably," Harry said. "Classic Luna," Neville said, with the warmth of someone who had come to love that about her. Ron arrived with 2 glasses and handed one to Harry and looked at the painting and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You should hang that somewhere." "I will," Harry said. "In the new house," Ron said. "When you get one." Harry looked at him. "Grimmauld Place isn't yours," Ron said. "Not really. It's Sirius's and Dumbledore's and the Order's. You need somewhere that's actually," he gestured. "Yours." Harry thought about that. A house. Somewhere that had never been anything except a place he'd chosen. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." "Not maybe," Ron said, with the specific gentle firmness of someone who had been paying attention. "You've spent 2 months building things for everyone else. Build yourself somewhere to live." Harry looked at the painting, at the small figure of himself at the south point, the light between all of them. He thought about what he wanted, which he was still learning was a legitimate category of thought. "Yeah," he said. "All right." The evening continued. People talked and laughed and George did something with a Weasley firework that made Molly say his name in a specific tone and made everyone else dive for their glasses. Luna came back from the grass with something cupped in her hands that she showed to Ginny, who looked at it and then at Luna with an expression of surprised delight that Harry stored carefully, because it looked like the beginning of something. Hermione and Arthur were still talking, and from the gestures it had moved from whatever the first thing was into international magical legal theory, and Arthur was keeping up and clearly enjoying it. Malfoy sat at the edge of the gathering, not isolated but not fully inside it either, in the careful position of someone who was here and was aware of how far here was from where he'd expected to be. Harry walked over and sat beside him on the garden bench. "How are you doing?" Harry asked. Malfoy looked at the garden, the people in it. "I'm deciding," he said. "Between feeling extremely out of place and feeling something else." He paused. "The something else is winning." "What's the something else?" Harry asked. Malfoy was quiet for a moment. The firework George had launched earlier was still dispersing in the sky above them, golden trails going soft against the darkening blue. "I think it might be gratitude," he said, with the precision of someone who had identified an unfamiliar sensation and named it carefully. "Which is?" He looked at Harry. "I've not had much practice with that." "There's time," Harry said. "Yes," Malfoy said. "There seems to be." They sat in the Burrow Garden while the evening settled fully into night, and the stars came out over the Ottery St. Catchpole countryside, and the table around them continued its slow comfortable dispersal, and Harry felt the 4 rings on his hands with the deliberate attention he'd given them that morning: Gryffindor warm, Peverell cool, Slytherin neutral, Emery's absent present, and felt the compact beneath them, steady and patient, 800 years of purpose expressed through the specific texture of an ordinary evening, a garden, a table, people who had chosen each other. He thought about what came next. Because something always came next. The Brandt Working Group and its incoming legal challenge. The 3 resistant Wizengamot members and their foot dragging on creature rights implementation. The American Magical Congress and Vasquez's ambitions for the model. The review court's next 17 cases, including 6 that were going to be complicated and 2 that were going to be genuinely difficult. The international magical community watching Britain to see whether this held or broke under pressure. He thought about all of it. Not with dread, with the specific appetite of someone who had found the thing they were built for. There was a difference between surviving problems and moving toward them, and Harry had been learning that difference for months now, and tonight in a garden under a country sky, the difference was clear. He stood. He put the painting carefully back in his pocket. He looked at the table and the people around it, Ron and Hermione side by side, Neville at the fence with the posture of someone who had stopped apologizing for his own height, Luna in the grass discovering something beautiful in the dark, Ginny with her laugh bright and real, George making something impossible look easy, Arthur delighting in the world, Molly moving through her garden with the particular authority of a woman in her rightful place, and he felt the wholeness of it, which was not perfect, which was not without grief or complexity or the ongoing reality of things still broken and requiring work. Wholeness wasn't the absence of broken things. It was the presence of enough solid ground that the broken things had somewhere to be repaired. He walked back to the table and picked up his glass and sat back down between Ron and Neville, and the garden received him back into its conversation, and the night was warm and the stars were doing what stars did, which was exist at enormous distance and look like closeness, and Harry Potter sat in the center of something he'd built and let himself, deliberately and without qualification, simply be in it. Malfoy sat down across from him. "George wants to know," he said, with the expression of someone delivering a message they find genuinely baffling, "if you'd be interested in a limited edition range of Lord Potteremry's merchandise. He has ideas involving the 4 Lordship sigils and what he's calling tasteful novelty applications." Harry looked at George. George raised his glass with the beam of a man who had absolutely meant it. "Tell him," Harry said, "that if he donates half the proceeds to the Janus Thicky ward at St. Mungo's, I'll consider it." Malfoy relayed this. George's beam intensified into something that suggested he'd already been thinking about charity applications and now had a specific one. He pointed at Harry with the finger of a man who had made a deal he liked. "Done," Malfoy said, returning. "Of course it is," Harry said, and drank his wine, and the Burrow garden went on around him, warm and loud and real. He thought, just once more, about the boy who had walked into Gringotts on a Tuesday morning with a cold piece of toast and a letter that used the word pressing. That boy had not known, sitting in the pre-dawn kitchen, that this was where Tuesday was going. But if you'd asked him, if you'd shown him the garden and the people and the rebuilt court and the international session and the 4 rings and the painting in his pocket and the work still ahead, he wouldn't have been afraid of it. He would have walked through the door. He always walked through the door. That was the only thing that had ever really been true about him, and he was glad, finally, to know it without having to prove it to anyone. The stars were out. The garden was warm. Something important had been built, and it was going to keep being built, and Harry Potter was going to be there for all of it. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything.